Chapter 76 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. Harold's Footman. "Bob," called Harold to his little brother who was playing on the back doorstep, "trot out to the barn and bring me my saw, will you?" Bobby left his two pet cats, Topsy and Tiger, on the steps, and ran obediently for the tool. Harold was very busy constructing a hen coop, and he needed a great deal of assistance. "Thanks," he said, shortly, as the little boy returned. "Now, where did I put those nails?" "Oh, they're on the kitchen table. Hand them out." Bobby produced the nails, and sat down again to watch the work. "Are you going to finish it today, Hal?" he asked. "No, haven't time. I'm going to the Commons in about 10 minutes. There is a lacrosse match on, but I want to drive these nails first. Oh, say, Bob, my lacrosse stick is up in my room. You go and bring it down. I'm so awfully busy." Bobby ran eagerly up the stairs. He always went on errands for his big brother very willingly, but this time he made special haste, for a hope was entering his heart that perhaps Hal would take him to see the match. "Mother!" he cried, poking his head out to the shady front veranda where his mother and aunt sat sewing. "Hal's going to the Commons. May I go too?" His mother looked up from her sewing rather doubtfully. "Oh, I really don't know, dearie," she began. "Oh, let the poor wee man go," pleaded Aunt Kate, when she saw the look of disappointment on Bobby's round face. "Hal will take care of him." "Well, keep near Hal, Bobby. I don't like you crossing the railroad track." Bobby bounded out to the backyard in high glee, waving the lacrosse stick. "Mother says I can go too," he shouted, jumping down the steps in a manner that made Tiger and Topsy rise up indignantly and move to one side. "Oh, pshaw!" cried his brother, hammering a nail rather viciously. "What do you always want to follow me around for?" "Oh, can't I go?" cried the little fellow in distress. "Oh, Hal, do let me." "I can't have a kid like you forever tagging after me. Why can't you play with boys of your own age? You can't come today. That's all about it." "Oh, Hal, you might let me. I won't be a bother." Bobby's eyes were beginning to brim over with tears. His face wore a look of despair. "Oh, cry, baby. Of course you must howl. You can stay at home and play with the cats." And the big brother whom Bobby had served so willingly all day shouldered his lacrosse stick and went off whistling. Harold met his Aunt Kate in the hall. "Where is your little footman?" she asked gaily. "Isn't he going?" "Who, Bob? Oh, Aunt Kate, he's too small to go everywhere with me." "Ah." Aunt Kate looked surprised. "I thought he was quite big enough to be with you when there was work to be done, but I see a footman is wanted to run errands and do such things." Harold was not very well acquainted with his aunt, and he was never quite sure whether she was in fun or not. The idea of her saying Bob was his footman! He felt quite indignant. He had just reached the street when he remembered that he had left his ball where he had been working. He half wished Bobby were with him, so he could send him back for it. And then he felt ashamed when he remembered his aunt's words. Was she right after all? And did he make use of his little brother, and then thrust him aside when he did not need him? He did not like the idea of facing Aunt Kate again, so he slipped in through the back gate and walked quietly around the house. As he approached the house, he heard a voice, and paused a moment, hidden by a lilac bush. Poor lonely Bobby was sitting on the steps, one hand on Tiger's neck while the other stroked Topsy. He was pouring out to his two friends all his troubles. "He doesn't like me, Tops, not one little bit. He never wants me around, only to run and get things for him. You don't be bad to Tops just 'cause she's littler than you, do you, Tiger? But I guess you like Topsy, and Hal don't like me. He don't like me one little teenty bit." Here a sob choked him, and through the green branches Harold could see a big teardrop upon Topsy's velvet coat. "I wish I had a brother that liked me," went on the pitiful little voice. "Tom Benson likes Charlie. He likes him an awful lot. And Charlie doesn't do nearly so many things as I do. I guess I oughtn't to tell Tiger, but you and Tops wouldn't tell tales, so it isn't the same as telling father or mother, or Aunt Kate, is it, Tig? But I think he might like me a little wee bit, don't you, Tiger?" And Harold could see the blue blouse sleeve raised to brush away the hot tears. Harold drew back quietly and tiptoed down the walk to the street. He had forgotten all about the ball. His eyes were so misty that he did not notice Charlie Benson, waiting for him at the gate, until Tom called, "Hello there, I thought you were never coming. What kept you?" "Say, is Charlie going?" asked Harold suddenly. "Of course I am," cried the little fellow, cutting a caper on the sidewalk. "Tom said I could, didn't you, Tom?" Tom laughed good-naturedly. "He was bound to come," he said. "He won't bother us." "Well, I think Bob wants to come too," said Harold hesitatingly. "And if Charlie is going—" "Oh, goody!" cried Charlie, who was Bobby's special chum. "Where is he?" Harold put his fingers to his lips and uttered 2 sharp whistles. Bobby understood the signal and came around the side of the house. He had carefully wiped away his tears, but his voice was rather shaky. "What do you want?" he called. He felt sure Hal had an errand for him. "Charlie's going to the Commons with us," shouted his brother, "so I guess you can come if you want to." Bobby came down the path in leaps and bounds. "I'm going, Mother!" he shouted, waving his cap, and away he and Charlie tore down the street ahead of their brothers. "Hold on there!" cried Harold with a laugh. "Don't get crazy, and mind you two keep near us at the track." It was about a week later that Aunt Kate laid her hand on Harold's shoulder and said, "I am afraid I made a mistake the other day, Hal. I believe Bobby's been promoted from the rank of footman to be a brother." Martha Graham, in The King's Own. End of chapter 76. Chapter 77 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. Elnathan Scold. One morning, Christopher Lightenhome, aged 68, received an unexpected legacy of $600. His good old face betokened no surprise, but it shone with a great joy. "I am never surprised at the Lord's mercies," he said reverently. Then, with a step to which vigor had suddenly returned, he sought out Elnathan Ousley, aged 12. "Elnathan," he said, "I guess I am the oldest man in the poorhouse, but I feel just about your age. Suppose you and I get out of here." The boy smiled. He was very old for 12, even as Christopher Lightenhome was very young for 68. "For a poorhouse, this is a good place," continued Christopher, still with that jubilant tone in his voice. "It is well conducted, just as the country reports say. Still, there are other places that suit me better. You come and live with me, Elnathan. What do you say to it, boy?" "Where are you going to live?" asked Elnathan cautiously. The old man regarded him approvingly. "You'll never be one to get out of the frying pan into the fire, will you?" he said. "But I know a room. I have had my eye on it. It is big enough to have a bed, a table, a cook stove, and 3 chairs in it, and we could live there like lords. Like lords, boy, just think of it. I can get it for $2 a month." "With all these things in it?" "No, with nothing in it, but I can buy the things, Elnathan, get them cheap at the second-hand store. And I can cook to beat, well, to beat some women anyway." He paused to think a moment of Adelizy, one of the pauper cooks. Yes, he thought, Adelizy has her days. She is systematic. Some days things are all but pickled in brine, and other days she doesn't put in any salt at all. Some days they're overcooked, and other days it seems as if Adelizy jerked them off the stove before they were heated through. Then he looked eagerly into the unresponsive young face before him. "What's the matter with my plan, Elnathan?" he asked gravely. "Why don't you fall in with it? I never knew you to hang off like this before." "I haven't any money," was the slow answer. "I can't do my share toward it, and I'm not going to live off of you. Your money will last you twice as long if you don't have to keep me. Adelizy says $600 isn't much if you think it is a fortune, and you'll soon run through with it and be back here again." For a moment the old man was stung. "I shan't spend the most of it for salt to put in my victuals anyway," he said. Then his face cleared and he laughed. "So you haven't any money and you won't let me keep you," he continued. "Well, those are pretty honourable objections. I expect to do away with them, though, immediately." He drew himself up and said impressively, "That is gold which is worth gold. You've got the gold all right, Elnathan, or the money, whichever you choose to call it." Elnathan stared. "Why, boy, look here," Mr. Lightenhome exclaimed, as he seized the hard young arm, where much enforced toil had developed good muscle. "There's your gold, in that right arm of yours. What you want to do is to get it out of your arm and into your pocket. I don't need to keep you. You can live with me and keep yourself. What do you say now?" The boy's face was alight. "Let's go today," he said. "Not today, tomorrow," decided Mr. Lightenhome gravely. "When I was young, before misfortune met me and I was cheated out of all I had, I was used to giving spreads. We'll give one tonight to those we used to be fellow paupers with no longer ago than yesterday, and tomorrow we will go. We began this year in the poorhouse, we will end it in our own home. That is one of the bad beginnings that made a good ending, boy. There is more than one of them. Mind that." The morrow came, and the little home was started. Another morrow followed, and Elnathan began in earnest to try getting the gold out of his arm and into his pocket. He was a dreamy boy, with whom very few had had patience, for nobody, not even himself, knew the resistless energy and dogged perseverance that lay dormant within him. Mr. Lightenhome, however, suspected it. "I believe," he said to himself, "that Elnathan, when he once gets awakened, will be a hustler. But the poorhouse isn't exactly the place to rouse up the ambition of Napoleon Bonaparte in any boy. Having a chance to scold somebody is what Adelizy calls one of the comforts of a home. And she certainly took out her comforts on Elnathan, and all the rest helped her, sort of deadening to him, though. Living here with me and doing for himself is a little more like what's needed in his case." Slowly Elnathan waked, and Mr. Lightenhome had patience with him. He earned all he could, and he kept himself from being a burden on his only friend, but he disliked work, and so he lagged over it. He did all that he did well, however, and he was thoroughly trustworthy. 3 years went by. Elnathan was 15 years old, and Christopher Lightenhome was 71. The little room had always been clean. There had been each day enough nourishing food to eat, though the old man, remembering Adelizy's prediction, had set his face like flint against even the slightest indulgence in table luxuries. And although there had been days when Elnathan had recklessly brought home a 10-cent pie and half a dozen doughnuts from the baker's as his share of provisions for their common dinner, Mr. Lightenhome felt that he had managed well. And yet there were only $50 of the original $600 left, and the poorhouse was looming once more on the old man's sight. He sighed. An expression of patience grew on the kind old face. He felt it to be a great pity that $600 could not be made to go farther. And there was a wistfulness in the glance that he cast upon the boy. Elnathan was as yet only half awake. The little room and the taste of honest independence had done their best. Were they to fail? The old man began to economize. His mittens wore out. He did not buy more. He needed new flannels, but he did not buy them. Instead he tried to patch the old ones, and Elnathan, coming in suddenly, caught him doing it. "Why, Uncle Chris!" he exclaimed. "What are you patching those old things for? Why don't you pitch them out and get new ones?" The old man kept silent till he had his needle threaded. Then he said softly, with a half apology in his tone, "The money is most gone, Elnathan." The boy started. He knew as well as Mr. Lightenhome that when the last coin was spent, the doors of the poorhouse would open once more to receive his only friend. A thrill of gladness went through Elnathan as he recognized that no such fate awaited him. He could provide for himself. He need never return. And by that thrill in his own bosom he guessed the feeling of his friend. He could not put what he guessed into words. Nevertheless, he felt sure that the old man would not falter nor complain. "How much have you?" he asked. Mr. Lightenhome told him. Then, without a word, Elnathan got up and went out. His head sunk in thought and his hands in his trouser pockets, he sauntered on in the wintry air while he mentally calculated how long Mr. Lightenhome's fund would last. Not any later than next Christmas he will be in the poorhouse again. He walked only a few steps. Then he stopped. "Will he?" he cried. "Not if I know it." This was a big resolve for a boy of 15, and the next morning Elnathan himself thought so. He thought so even to the extent of considering a retreat from the high task which he had the previous day laid before himself. Then he looked at Mr. Lightenhome, who had aged perceptibly in the last hours. Evidently he had lain awake in the night calculating how long his money would last. The sight of him nerved the boy afresh. "I'm not going back on it," he told himself vigorously. "I am just going to dig out all the gold there is in me. Keeping Uncle Chris out of the poorhouse is worth it." But he did not confide in the old man. "He would say it was too big a job for me and talk about how I ought to get some schooling," concluded the boy. Now it came about that the room, which, while it had not been the habitation of lords, had been the abode of kingly kindness, became a silent place. The anxious old man had no heart to joke. He had been to the poorhouse and had escaped from it into freedom. His whole nature rebelled at the thought of returning. And yet he tried to school himself to look forward to it bravely. "If it is the Lord's will," he told himself, "I will have to bow to it." Meanwhile, those who employed Elnathan were finding him a very different boy from the slow, lagging Elnathan they had known. If he was sent on an errand, he made speed. "Here, get the gold out of your legs," he would say to himself. If he sprouted potatoes for a grocer in his cellar, "There's the gold in your fingers, El," he would say. "Get it out as quick as you can." He now worked more hours in a day than he had ever worked before, so that he was too tired to talk much at meals and too sleepy in the evening. But there was a light in his eyes when they rested on Mr. Lightenhome that made the old man's heart thrill. "Elnathan would stand by me if he could," he would say to himself. "He is a good boy. I must not worry him." A month after Elnathan had begun his great labor of love, an astonishing thing happened to him. He had a choice of 2 places offered him as general utility boy in a grocery. Once he would have told Mr. Lightenhome and asked his advice as to which offer he should take, but he was now carrying his own burdens. He considered carefully, and then he went to Mr. Benson. "Mr. Benson," he said, "Mr. Dale wants me too, and both offer the same wages. Now, which one of you will give me my groceries reduced, as you do your other clerks?" "I will not," replied Mr. Benson firmly. "Your demand is ridiculous. You are not a clerk." The irate Mr. Benson turned on his heel, and Elnathan felt himself dismissed. He then went to Mr. Dale, to whom he honestly related the whole. Mr. Dale laughed. "But you are not a clerk," he said kindly. I know it, but I mean to be, and I mean to do all I can for you too. Mr. Dale looked at him, and he liked the bearing of the lad. Go ahead, he said. You may have your groceries at the same rate I make clerks. Thank you, responded Elnathan, while the gratitude he felt crept into his tones. For myself, he thought, I would not have asked for a reduction, but for Uncle Chris I will. I have a big job on hand. That day he told Mr. Lightenhome that he had secured a place at Mr. Dale's, and that he was to have a reduction on groceries. Which means, Uncle Chris, that I pay for the groceries for us both, while you do the cooking and pay the rent. Silently and swiftly Mr. Lightenhome calculated. He saw that if he were saved the buying of the groceries for himself, he could eke out his small hoard till after Christmas. The poorhouse receded a little from the foreground of his vision as he gazed into the eyes of the boy opposite him at the table. He did not know that his own eyes spoke eloquently of his deliverance, but Elnathan choked as he went on eating. Now hustle, El, he commanded one day on his way back to the store. There's gold in your eyes if you keep them open, and in your tongue if you keep it civil, and in your back, and in your wits if they are nimble. All I have to say is, get it out. Get it out, he repeated, when he had reached the rear of the store. And he began busily to fill and label kerosene cans, gasoline cans, and molasses jugs. From there he went to the cellar to measure up potatoes. Never saw such a fellow, grumbled his companion utility boy. You'd think he run the store by the way he steps round with his head up and them sharp eyes of his into everything. Hi there, he said to me, fill that measure of gasoline full before you pour it into the can. Mr. Dale doesn't want the name of giving short measure because you are careless. Let's do some reporting on him and get him out of the store, he said. But there is nothing to report, and there never will be. But the boy persisted, and very shortly he found himself out of a position. You needn't get another boy if you don't want to, Mr. Dale, observed Elnathan cheerily. I'm so used to the place now that I can do all he did as well as my own work. And anyway, I would rather do the extra work than go on watching somebody to keep him from measuring up short or wrong grade on anything he touches. And Elnathan smiled. He had lately discovered that he had ceased to hate work. Mr. Dale smiled in return. Very well, he said. Go ahead and do it all if you want to. A week he went ahead, and at the end of that time he found, to his delight, that Mr. Dale had increased his wages. Did you think I would take the work of 2 boys and pay for the work of 1? Asked Mr. Dale. I didn't think at all, sir, replied Elnathan joyously, but I am the gladdest boy in Kingston to get a raise. Uncle Chris, he said that night, I got a raise today. Mr. Lightenhome expressed his pleasure, and he sensed that the honour was well merited, but Elnathan did not hear a word he said because he had something more to say himself. Uncle Chris, he went on, his face very red, I have been saving up for some time, and tomorrow is your birthday. Here is a present for you. And he thrust out a $10 piece with the words, I never made a present before. Slowly the old man took the money, and again his eyes outdid his tongue in speaking his gratitude, and there was a great glow in the heart of the boy. That's some of the gold I dug out of myself, Uncle Chris, he laughed. You are the one who first told me it was in me. I do not know whether it came out of my arms or my legs or my head. I know where the very best gold there is in you is located, Elnathan, smiled the old man. It is your heart that is gold, my boy. 2 months later, Elnathan was a clerk at $25 a month. Now we're fixed, Uncle Chris, he cried when he told the news. You and I can live forever on $25 a month. Do you mean it? Asked the old man tremblingly. Do you wish to be cumbered with me? No, I do not, Uncle Chris, answered the boy with a beaming look. I do not want to be cumbered with you. I just want to go on living here with you. Then to the old man the poorhouse forever receded from sight. He remembered Adelizy no more, as he looked with pride and tenderness on the boy who stood erect and alert before him, looked again and yet again, for he saw in him the Lord's deliverer, though he knew not that he had been raised up by his own kind hand. Julielma Trollinger, in the Wellspring. End of chapter 77.
Chapter 78 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. Chapter 78. Only a Jackknife. When the lamented James A. Garfield was struggling to obtain an education, he supported himself for several years by teaching. His first school was in Muskingum County, Ohio, and the little frame house where he began his work as a teacher is still standing, while some of the boys and girls who received instruction from him that term are yet alive to testify to his faithfulness as a common school teacher. He was quite a young man at the time. In fact, he was still in his teens, and it must have been rather embarrassing for him to attempt to teach young men and women, some of them older than himself. But he was honest in his efforts to try to do his best, and, as is always the case under such circumstances, he succeeded admirably. One day, after repeatedly cautioning a little chap not to hack his desk with the new Barlow in his possession, the young teacher transferred the offending knife to his own pocket, quietly informing the culprit that it should be returned at the close of the afternoon session. During the afternoon, 2 of the committeemen called to examine the school, and young Garfield was so interested in the special recitations conducted that he let the boy go home in the evening without even mentioning the knife. The subject did not recur to him until after supper, and perhaps would not have been recalled to him then had not he chanced to put his hand into his pocket for a pencil. "Look there," he exclaimed, holding up the knife. "I took it from Sandy Williams, with the promise that it should be returned in the evening, and I have let him go home without it. I must carry it to him at once." "Never mind, man, let it stand till morning," urged Mrs. Ross, the motherly woman with whom he boarded. "I cannot do that," replied Garfield. "The little fellow will think I'm a thief." "No danger of that, James," insisted the well-meaning woman. "He will know that you forgot it, and all will be well in the morning." "But you see, I promised, Mrs. Ross, and a promise is always binding. I must go tonight and carry it to him," urged the young man, drawing on his coat. "It is all of 2 miles to his father's, and just look how dark it is, and raining too," said the woman, opening the door to convince her boarder that things were as bad as she had represented them. "I am young and strong, and can make my way quite easily," insisted Garfield. "It is always better to right a wrong as soon as you discover it, and I would rather walk the 4 miles in the mud and rain than disappoint one of my scholars. Sometimes example is more powerful than precept, and if I am not careful to live an honest life before my pupils, they will not give much heed to what I say on such subjects. There is no rule like the golden rule, but he who teaches it must also live it, if he expects others to follow his teaching." Mrs. Ross said no more, and James went on, as he had proposed. And before the little boy went to sleep, he was happy again in the possession of his treasure, over which he had been lamenting all the evening. The young teacher declined the hospitality of the family for the night, and walked back in the darkness to his boarding house, and, as he afterward said, felt all the better for standing up to his principles. End of chapter 78.
Chapter 79 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. A spelling bee. I'm going to have a spelling bee tonight, said Uncle John, and I will give a pair of skates to the boy who can spell man best. The children turned and stared into one another's eyes. Spell man best, Uncle John? Why, there is only one way, they cried. There are all sorts of ways, replied Uncle John. I will leave you to think of it a while. And he buttoned up his coat and went away. What does he mean? asked Bob. I think it is a joke, said Harry thoughtfully, and when Uncle John asks me, I'm going to say, why, MAN, of course. It is a conundrum, I know, said Joe, and he leaned his head on his hand and settled down to think. Time went slowly to the puzzled boys for all their fun that day. It seems as if after supper time would never come, but it came at last, and Uncle John came too with a shiny skate runner peeping out of his coat pocket. Uncle John did not delay. He sat down and looked straight into Harry's eyes. "Been a good boy today, Hal?" "Yes. No," said Harry, flushing. "I did something Aunt May told me not to do, because Ned Barnes dared me to. I cannot bear a boy to dare me. What's that got to do with spelling man?" he added half to himself. But Uncle John had turned to Bob. "Had a good day, my boy?" "Haven't had fun enough," answered Bob stoutly. "It is all Joe's fault, too. We boys wanted to pond to ourselves for one day, and we made up our minds that when the girls came we would clear them off. But Joe, he—" "I think this is Joe's to tell," interrupted Uncle John. "How was it, boy?" "Why," said Joe, "I thought the girls had as much right on the pond as the boys. So I spoke to one or two of the bigger boys, and they thought so too, and we stopped it all. I thought it was mean to treat the girls that way." There came a flash from Uncle John's pocket. The next minute the skates were on Joe's knees. "The spelling match is over," said Uncle John, "and Joe has won the prize." Three bewildered faces mutually questioned him. "Boys," he answered gravely, "we have been spelling man, not in letters, but in acts. I told you there were different ways, and we have proved it here tonight. Think it over, boys, and see." Sunday School Evangelist. End of chapter 79. Recording by SaraHale.
Chapter 80 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. Jack's Queer Ways. Everybody liked Jack. He was a pleasant, manly boy, about 14 years old, a boy who was on friendly terms with the whole world. His father was a physician, and his family lived in a small country town. Of course, Jack went to school. In the afternoon, when school was over, he always ran up to his mother's room to tell her, in his bright boyish way, how the day had passed, and to see if she had any errands for him to do, always glad to help in any way he could. After this little chat with his mother, he would dash off into the yard to play, or to busy himself in some other way. But he was never far away, ready to be called on any moment, and generally where he could be seen from some of the many windows of the big old-fashioned house. This had always been his custom until the winter of which I am speaking. This winter Jack seemed to have fallen into queer ways. He came home, to be sure, at the usual time, but after the little visit with his mother seemed to disappear entirely. For an hour and a half he positively could not be found. They could not see him, no matter which way they looked, and they could not even make him hear when they called. This all seemed very strange, but he had always been a trusty boy, and his mother thought little of it at first. Still, As Jack continued to disappear day after day at the same hour for weeks, she thought it best to speak to his father about it. "How long does he stay out?" asked the doctor. "Very often till the lamps are lighted," was the answer. "Have you asked him where he goes?" "Why, yes," the mother replied, "and that's the strangest part of it all. He seems so confused and doesn't answer directly, but tries to talk about something else. I cannot understand it, but some way I do not believe he is doing wrong, for he looks right into my eyes and does not act as if he had anything to be ashamed of." "It is quite strange," said the doctor. Then he sat quiet for a long time. At last he said, "Well, little mother, I think we will trust the lad a while longer, and say nothing more to him about it, though it is strange." Time passed on, and the mother looked anxious many an evening as she lighted the lamps and her boy was not home yet. And when at last he did come in, flushed and tired, and said not a word as to how he had spent his afternoon, she wondered more than ever. This kept up all winter. Towards spring the doctor was slowly driving home one day just at twilight, when, as he passed a poor, forlorn cottage, he heard a rap on the window. He stopped his horse at once, got out of his gig and walked to the door. He knocked, but no one opened, only a voice called, "Come in." He entered the shabby room and found a poor old woman lying on a miserable bed. The room was bare and cheerless except for the bright fire burning in the small stove, beside which lay a neat pile of wood. The doctor did what he could to ease the poor woman's sufferings, and then asked who lived with her to take care of her. "Not a soul," she said. "I am all alone. I haven't a chick nor child in the whole wide world." The doctor looked at the wood near the stove, and wondered to himself how the sick old woman could chop and pile it so nicely, but he said nothing, and she went on sadly, "I have had a hard time of it this winter, and I would have died, sure, if it hadn't been for that blessed boy." "Why, I thought you lived alone and had no children," exclaimed the doctor. "No more I haven't," she said. "I am all alone by my lone self, as I told ye, but the good Lord has been a-taking care of me, for a bit of a boy, bless his heart, has been a-coming here every day this winter, for to help me. He chopped the wood the minister sent me, and brought some in here every night, and piled it up like that," pointing to the sticks in the corner, "and the harder it stormed, the surer he seemed to come. He'd never so much as tell me where he lived. I only know his name is—" "Jack?" asked the doctor with unsteady voice. "Yes, sir, that's it. Do you be knowing him, doctor?" "I think perhaps I do," was the husky answer. "Well, may the Lord bless him, and may he never be called himself the good lad." The doctor did not speak for a few moments. Then he left, promising to send someone to care for the sick woman that night. He drove home very fast, and a strange dimness came into his eyes every now and then as he thought it all over. He went to his wife's room and began as usual to tell her all that had happened during the day. When at last he came to his visit at the cottage, he watched his wife's face as he told of the lonely, sick old woman, the warm fire, and the young chopper. When he had finished, tears were in her eyes, but she only said, "Dear Jack." Jack's queer ways were explained at last, and Jack's old woman, as they called her, never wanted from this time for any comfort as long as she lived. So, after all, Jack could not feel so very sorry that his kindness done in secret had at last found him out. The Round Table. End of chapter 80.
Chapter 81 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. My Missionary Garden. Some money I desired to earn to send to foreign lands, so mother took some garden seeds and placed them in my hands. Then earnestly I went to work with spade and rake and hoe. I planted every seed I had, and wondered if they'd grow. It wasn't long before I saw some little leaves of green. I thought they looked more beautiful than any I had seen. Each day when I came home from school I to my garden went. In hoeing and in pulling weeds my leisure time I spent. My mother said to me, "My child, you've worked so very well, I'll buy of you, if you desire, whate'er you have to sell." I never tasted anything so tender and so sweet. I thanked the Lord most heartily for all I had to eat. My mother is so good to me, but God is better still. Whatever I can do for Him, with all my heart I will. Dora Borison. End of chapter 81.
Chapter 82 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by T.K. Andersen. What One Boy Did. "Don't tell me that boys have no influence," said the dark-eyed lady with emphasis. "Why, I myself know of a boy of 12 whose influence changed the manners of an entire hotel." "Tell you about it? Certainly. It was a family hotel on the seacoast in Southern California, and almost all the guests in the house were there for the winter. We had become well acquainted, and well lazy, I guess is the best word for it. So we decided that it was too much trouble to dress for meals, and dropped into the habit of coming in just as we chanced to be, from lounging in the hammock, or fishing off the pier, or bicycle riding down the beach. Our manners, too, had become about as careless as our dress. We were there for a rest, a good time, and these little things didn't matter, we said. One day there was a new arrival, Mrs. Blend, a young widow with her little son Robert, as sturdy, bright-faced a lad of 12 as one often sees. The first time he came into the dining room, erect, manly, with his tie and collar and dress in perfect order, escorting his mother as if she had been a princess, and standing till not only she, but every lady at the table was seated, we all felt that a breath of new air had come among us, and everyone there, I think, straightened up a little. However, we looked at one another and nodded our heads, as much as to say, "He won't keep this up long." We were strangers, and in the familiarity of everyday life, we did not doubt that it would soon wear away. But it did not. Rob was full of life, and active and busy as a boy could well be. At the same time, when, 20 minutes before meals, his mother blew a little silver whistle, no matter where he was or what he was doing, everything was dropped, and he ran in to make himself ready. And every time he came to the table, with his clean face and smooth hair, and clothes carefully arranged or changed, he was in himself a sermon on neatness and self-respect, which, though none of us had said much about it, we felt all the same. Then by and by one and another began to respond to the little silver whistle as well as Rob. One laid aside a bicycle dress, another a half-invalid negligee, till you could hardly have believed that it was the same company of a few weeks before. It was the same with manners. Rob's politeness, simple, unaffected, and unfailing, at the table, on the veranda, upon the beach, wherever you met him, his readiness to be helpful, his deference to those older, his thoughtfulness for all was the best lesson, that of example. As a consequence, the thoughtless began to remember, and the selfish to feel ashamed, and the careless to keep themselves more in hand. And so, as I said in the beginning, in less than a month the whole atmosphere of that hotel had been changed by the influence of one boy, and the only one utterly unconscious of this was Rob himself. This is truly a pleasing incident. We like to think of this boy who, because he was at heart a true little gentleman, drew what was kindly and courteous and gracious in those about him to the surface as by a magnet. In like manner it is possible for every boy to be so true and kindly and tender, so unselfish of action, so obedient to duty, so responsive to conscience, that, wherever he goes, he shall carry an inspiring atmosphere and influence with him, and whoever he meets shall, because of him, be drawn to better thoughts and nobler living. End of chapter. Chapter 83 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by T.K. Andersen. How Nick Learned Manners. "Hello, Doc, where'd you get that horse?" called Nick Hammond as he approached his father and Dr. Morris as they were talking at the gate one evening.
"Why, hello, little man. I got this horse over the river. Ever seen him before?"
answered the old doctor genially, little thinking that he was somewhat to blame for Nick's lack of good manners in thus accosting an older person. When the doctor had gone, Mr. Hammond called Nick to him and said, "Nick, did your mother not tell you last evening not to say hello when you meet people?" Nick's eyes fell, for he remembered, and he said, "Yes, sir."
"Then why did you say it to Dr. Morris this evening?"
"Oh, I don't think he cares what I say to him."
"No, I do not suppose he does care, but I do. And I think if your mother had heard you address the doctor as Doc, she would have been very much ashamed, for she has tried very hard to teach you good manners."
"Well, everybody says hello, Papa, and I can't help it, and I'm sure Mr. Evans said Doc when he was talking out there this evening."
"It is true that a great many people do use both words, but that is no reason why you should use them, when you have been told not to do so. There is also some difference, I think, between the age of Mr. Evans and yourself. Men can say things to one another that would be quite improper for a boy to say to a man. Now I want you to be more careful, and speak respectfully to everyone you meet."
Nick went to his play, but he took up a string of reasoning like this. "Because I'm the only boy, Mama has set out to make me as good as Mabel, and she doesn't allow me to use slang nor anything of the kind. I know if there were half a dozen boys here, it would be different. I suppose it is all right for girls and women, but bah! I can't be a goody-goody. I'm only a boy. I guess it won't pay to bother about good manners, like a girl. I'm too busy these days, when there's no school, to learn manners or anything else anyway." And he went off with his goat to forget everything else. Time after time, Nick failed to heed what he had been told, and each time he had to suffer a just penalty, but it seemed as if he never could learn manners. The real reason was that he had no desire to have good manners. One morning, Mrs. Hammond said, "Now, Nick, I am expecting your Aunt Ella and Uncle Alfred today, and I want you to be on your guard while they are here, and not act as if you were a backwoods boy who does not know anything. I especially want you to be gentlemanly, for Uncle Alfred is such a stranger to us yet that he will not understand you, and will think less of your papa and myself for seeing you rude and ill-mannered. You see, you owe it to yourself to make everyone like you as much as possible. They live so far away that it may be a long time before they will see you again. Well, I should like to see my new Uncle Alf. I hope they won't stay long, for I do hate to be afraid to halloo and do things. Now, don't say Uncle Alf, Nick. You know better than that. Say Uncle Alfred, but don't say it too often. As for making a noise, you can relieve yourself when away from the house, but I do not want you to talk when others are talking, and above all, do not contradict them no matter what they say." "All right, Mama, I'll try," promised Nick. But alas for his promise. It belonged to the very large family of promises that Nick had been making for many months. It was as easily broken as a broom straw. Aunt Ella and her husband, who was president of the Great Western College, were not long in seeing the worst side of little Nick. He repeatedly did the things his mamma had urged him not to do, and was recklessly disobedient in general. The last day of the visit was to be spent with some distinguished friends of Uncle Alfred's at the lake house, 9 miles away. Mr. and Mrs. Hammond were going with them, and Nick was determined to go too. When his mamma went to her room to get ready, Nick followed her and begged her to take him. "No, Nick," she said in a positive way, "I shall not take you anywhere until you learn to behave as a boy of your age should. Go to the dining room and wait there until we're ready to start, and then you can come down to Grandma Hammond's and stay until 4 o'clock. He knew that it was no use to tease, so he went to the couch in the dining room. He felt very sullen and bitter, and threw himself down on the friendly pillows to indulge in a few tears. In a few moments he heard subdued voices on the veranda just outside the window. Aunt Ella was saying, "I know they would both enjoy the drive this lovely day."
"Of course they would," said Uncle Alfred. "And I would like to have them with us. But what would Dr. and Mrs. Watson think of Nick? He surely is the rudest child I have ever known. I am sorry to cheat Mabel out of pleasure, for she is a dear little girl. But really, Ella, I should be ashamed of Nick's behavior, shouldn't you?"
Nick waited to hear no more. He slipped out quickly and said to the cook in the kitchen, "Please tell Mama I didn't wait. I've gone to Grandma's." He was so quiet and gentle all day that Grandma Hammond worried a great deal, saying,
"I never saw the like of it. The boy is either sick or something is going to happen to him."
That something had already happened to him, but Grandma was not aware of it. For the first time in his life, Nick felt ashamed of himself. During that long, long day, he made a strong resolution, which he never purposely broke, never to do anything to make himself or anybody else ashamed. Oh, there are many actors who can play greatly great parts, but rare indeed the soul. Who can be great when cast for some small role? Yet that is what the world most needs, big hearts that will shine forth and glorify poor parts in this strange drama, life.
End of chapter.
Chapter 84 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. Without Ballast. Not many years ago, the Escambia, a British iron steamer loaded with wheat, weighed anchor and started down the Bay of San Francisco. The pilot left her about 5 miles outside the Golden Gate. Looking back from his pilot boat a short time after, he saw the vessel stop, drift into the trough of the sea, carry into port, but bulwarks going under water, then suddenly capsize and sink. What was the cause of this sad catastrophe? A want of ballast. She came into port from China a few weeks previous, with 1,000 emigrants on board. But she had in her hold immense tanks for what is called water ballast. The captain, wishing to carry all the wheat he could between decks, neglected to fill those tanks. He thought the cargo would steady the ship, but it made it top heavy, and the first rough sea capsized it. Here then was a vessel, tight and strong, with powerful engines, with a cargo worth $100,000, floundering as soon as she left the harbour, taken down with a crew of 45 men, because the captain failed to have her properly ballasted. The moment she began to lurch, all the wheat tumbled over to the lower side, and down into the sea she went. How this wreck of the Escambia repeats the trite lesson that so many have tried to teach, and that they who need it most are slow to learn. Young men starting out in life want to carry as little ballast as possible. They are enterprising, ambitious. They are anxious to go fast and take as much cargo as they can. Old-fashioned principles are regarded as dead weight. It does not pay to hit them and they thrown overboard. Good home habits are abandoned in order to be popular with the gay and worldly. The Bible is not read, the Sabbath is not kept holy, prayer is neglected, and lo, someday, when all the sails are spread, a sudden temptation comes that wrecks the character and life. We cannot urge too strongly upon the young, in these days of intense activity, the vital importance of ballast. A conscience seems to be an encumbrance, an obstacle to prosperity. But it is a safe thing to have on board. It steadies the soul. It keeps it from careening when the winds drive it into the trough of the sea. If the Escambia had taken less wheat and more ballast, it might be afloat today. And this is true for many a man now in prison or in the gutter. The haste to be rich, the impatience of restraint. Alas, how their wrecks lie just outside the world's golden gates. End of Without Ballast. Recording by Apinoko.
Chapter 85 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. Reflex Influence. The artist Hoffman, it is said, became in features like the features that he strove to paint, those of his Lord. Unconsciously his thoughts developed in his face that which he sought upon the canvas to portray. And with the walls about him covered o'er with pictures he had made, he toiled and thought, and gave the world his ideal of the Christ, becoming more and more like him. And thus may we, by thinking o'er and o'er again Christ's thoughts, and dwelling on his love, become in heart as He, all undefiled and pure, perfect within. The beauty sweet and joy of holiness, communion with our God, the prayer of faith, the song of praise, and all the peace and uplift grand that Jesus knew, may be our own, our very own, to give unto the world made sick and sad by sin. Eliza H. Morton. End of chapter 85.
Chapter 86 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine Lehman, Reseda, California. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. Chapter 86. Influence of a Good Book. I lost my Christian mother when I was a youth, but not before the instruction I had received from her beloved lips had made a deep impression upon my mind, an impression which I carried with me into a college, Hampton, Sydney, where there was not then one pious student. There I often reflected, when surrounded by young men who scoffed at religion, upon the instruction of my mother, and my conscience was frequently sore distressed. I had no Bible, and dreaded getting one, lest it should be found in my possession. At last I could stand it no longer, and requested a particular friend, a youth whose parents lived near, and who often went home, to ask his excellent mother to send me some religious books. She sent me Aileen's Alarm, an old black book, which looked as if it might have been handled by successive generations for 100 years. When I received it, I locked my door and sat down to read it, when a student knocked at the door. I gave him no answer, dreading to be found reading such a book, but he continued to knock and beat the door until I had to open it. He came in, and seeing the book lying on the bed, seized it and examined its title. Then he said, "Why, Hill, do you read such books?" I hesitated, but God enabled me to be decided, and to tell him boldly, but with much emotion, "Yes, I do." The young man replied with much agitation, "Oh, Hill, you may obtain religion, but I never can. I came here a professor of religion, but through fear I dissembled it, and have been carried along with the wicked, until I fear there is no hope for me." He told me that there were 2 others who he believed were somewhat serious. We agreed to take up the subject of religion in earnest, and seek it together. We invited the other 2, and held a prayer meeting in my room on the next Saturday afternoon. And oh, what a prayer meeting! We knew not how to pray, but tried to do it. We sang in a suppressed manner, for we feared the other students, but they found us out, and gathered round the door, and made such a noise that the officers had to disperse them. So serious was the disturbance that the president, the late excellent Reverend Dr. John B. Smith, investigated the matter at prayers that evening in the chapel hall. When he demanded the reason of the riot, a ringleader in wickedness rose up, and stated that it was occasioned by 3 or 4 of the boys holding prayer meetings, and they were determined to have no such doings there. The good president heard the statement with deep emotion, and, looking at the youths charged with the sin of praying, said with tears in his eyes, "Oh, is there such a state of things in this college? Then God has come near to us. My dear young friends, you shall hold your next meeting in my parlor." We did hold our next meeting in his parlor, and half the college was there. And there began a glorious revival of religion, which pervaded the college and spread into the country around. Many of those students became ministers of the gospel. The youth who brought me Aileen's Alarm from his mother was my friend, the Reverend C. Stitt, who is preaching in Virginia, and he who interrupted me in reading the work, my venerable and worthy friend, the Reverend Dr. H., is now president of a college in the West. Selected. End of chapter 86. Recording by Christine Lehman, Reseda, California. Chapter 87 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine Lehman, Reseda, California. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. Chapter 87, Straightening Out the Furrows, and Short Poem. Boys, he said, I have been trying every day of my life for the last 2 years to straighten out furrows, and I cannot do it. One boy turned his head in surprise toward the captain's neatly kept place. Oh, I do not mean that kind, lad. I do not mean land furrows, continued the captain, so soberly that the attention of the boys became breathless as he went on. When I was a lad about the age of you boys, I was what they called a hard case, not exactly bad or vicious, but wayward and wild. Well, my dear old mother used to coax, pray, and punish. My father was dead, making it all the harder for her, but she never got impatient. How in the world she bore all my stubborn, vexing ways so patiently will always be, to me, one of the mysteries of life. I knew it was troubling her, knew it was changing her pretty face, making it look anxious and old. After a while, tired of all restraint, I ran away, went off to sea, and a rough time I had of it at first. Still, I liked the water, and I liked journeying around from place to place. Then I settled down to business in a foreign land, and soon became prosperous. Now I began sending her something besides empty letters, and such beautiful letters as she always wrote me during those years of absence. At length I noticed how long they grew, longing for the son who used to try her so, and it awoke a corresponding longing in my heart to go back to the dear waiting soul. So when I could stand it no longer, I came back, and such a welcome, and such a surprise! My mother is not a very old lady, boys, but the first thing I noticed was the whiteness of her hair and the deep furrows on her brow, and I knew I had helped to blanch that hair to its snowy whiteness, and had drawn those lines in that smooth forehead, and those are the furrows I have been trying to straighten out. But last night, while Mother was asleep in her armchair, I was thinking it all over, and looked to see what progress I had made. Her face was very peaceful, and the expression as contented as possible, but the furrows are still there. I have not succeeded in straightening them out, and I never shall, never. When they lay my mother, my fair old sweetheart, in her casket, there will be furrows on her brow, and I think it a wholesome lesson to teach you that the neglect you offer your parents' counsel now, and the trouble you cause them, will abide, my lads, it will abide. But, broke in Freddie Hollis, with great troubled eyes, I should think if you are so kind and good now, it need not matter so much. Ah, Freddie, said the quavery voice of the strong man, you cannot undo the past. You may do much to atone for it, do much to make the rough path smooth, but you cannot straighten out the old furrows. Remember that. Guess I'll go and chop some wood Mother spoke of. I had most forgotten, said lively Jimmy Hollis, in a strangely quiet tone for him. Yes, and I have some errands to do, suddenly remembered Billy Bowles. Touched and taken, said the kindly captain to himself, as the boys tramped off, keeping step in a soldier-like way. Mrs. Bowles declared a fortnight afterward that Billy was really getting to be a comfort, and Mrs. Hollis, meeting the captain about that time, remarked that Jimmy always meant to be a good boy, but now he was actually being one. Guess your stories they like so much have good morals in them now and then, added the gratified mother with a smile. As Mrs. Hollis passed, Captain Sam, with folded arms and head bent down, said softly to himself, "Well, I shall be thankful if a word of mine will help the dear boys to keep furrows from their mother's brows, for once there it is a difficult task to straighten them out." Selected. If you were busy being good, and doing just the best you could, you'd not have time to blame some man who's doing just the best he can. If you were busy being true to what you know you ought to do, you'd be so busy you'd forget the blunders of the folks you've met. If you were busy being right, you'd find yourself too busy quite to criticize your neighbor long, because he's busy being wrong. End of Chapter 87. Recording by Christine Lehman, Reseda, California. Chapter 88 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine Lehman, Reseda, California. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. Chapter 88. A Boy Who Was Wanted. "Well, I have found out one thing," said Jack, as, hot, tired, and dusty, he came to his mother. "What is that?" she asked. "That there are a great many boys in the world." "Didn't you know that before?" "Partly, but I didn't know there were so many more boys than are wanted." "Why do you think there are more than are wanted?" "Because I have been round and round till I am worn out trying to find a place to work. Wherever I go there are more boys than places. Doesn't that show that there are too many boys?" "Not exactly," said his mother, with a smile. "It depends entirely on the kind of boy. A good boy is always wanted somewhere." "Well, if I am a good boy, I wish I knew that I was wanted." "Patience, patience, my boy. In such a great world as this, with so many places and so many boys, it is no wonder some of them do not find their places at once. But be sure, dear," as she laid a very caressing hand on his arm, "that every boy who wants a chance to do fair, honest work will find it." "That's the kind of work I want to do," said Jack. "I don't want anybody's money for nothing. Let me see, what have I to offer? All the schooling and all the wits I have been able to get up in 13 years, good stout hands, and a civil tongue." "And a mind and heart set on doing faithful duty," suggested his mother. "I hope so," said Jack. "I remember father used to say, just as soon as you undertake to work for anyone, you must bear in mind that you have sold yourself for the given time. Your time, your strength, your energy are his, and your best efforts to seek his interests in every way are his due." The earnest tone in which the boy spoke seemed to give assurance that he would pay good heed to the words of the father, whose counsel could no more reach him. For 2 or 3 days longer Jack had reason to hold his opinion that there were more boys than the world wanted, at the end of which time he met a business man who, questioning him closely, said, "There are a great many applications for the place, but a large number of the boys come and stay a short time, and then leave if they think they can do a little better. When a boy gets used to our route and customers, we want him to stay. If you will agree to stay at least 3 years, we will agree to pay you $3 a week as errand boy." "That is just what I wanted to do, sir," said Jack eagerly. So he was installed, and proud enough he was to bring his wages home every week, and realize that, small as they were, the regular help was of great value to his mother. It is not to be wondered at that the faithful carrying out of his father's admonition, after a while, attracted the attention not only of his employers, but of others with whom he was brought in contact in the pursuit of his duties. One day he was asked into the office of Mr. Lang, a gentleman to whom he frequently carried parcels of value. "Have you ever thought of changing your situation?" asked Mr. Lang. "No, sir," said Jack. "Perhaps you could do better," said the other. "I want a boy who is quick and intelligent, and who can be relied on. And from what I see of you, I think you are that sort of boy. I want you to drive a delivery wagon, and will pay you $5 a week." Jack's eyes opened wide. "It is wonderfully good pay for a boy like me, I am sure, but I promised to keep on with Mr. Hill for 3 years, and the second year is only just begun." "Well, have you signed a regular agreement with Mr. Hill?" "No, sir. I told him I would stay." "You have a mother to assist, you told me. Could you not tell Mr. Hill that you feel obliged to do better when you have a chance?" "I don't believe I could," said Jack, looking with his straight, frank gaze into the gentleman's face. "You see, sir, if I broke my word with him, I should not be the kind of boy to be relied on that you want." "I guess you are about right," said Mr. Lang, with a sigh. "Come and see me when your time is out. I dare say I shall want you then." Jack went home very much stirred by what had been said to him. After all, could it be wrong to go where he would do so much better? Was it not really his duty to accept the position? He could then drive the wagon instead of trudging wearily along the streets. They had never felt so hot and dusty as they did just now, when he might escape from the tiresome routine. Might, but how? By the sacrifice of his pledged word, by selling his truth and his honor. So strongly did the reflection force itself upon him that when he told his mother of the offer he had received, he merely added, "It would be a grand good thing if I could take it, wouldn't it, mother?" Yes, it would. Some boys would change without thinking of letting a promise stand in their way. Yes, but that is the kind of boy who, sooner or later, is not wanted. It is because you have not been that sort of boy that you are wanted now. Jack worked away, doing such good work as he became more and more accustomed to the situation that his mother sometimes wondered that Mr. Hill, who seemed always kindly interested in him, never appeared to think of raising his pay. This, however, was not Mr. Hill's way of doing things, even though he showed an increasing disposition to trust Jack with important business. So the boy trudged through the 3 years, at the end of them having been trusted far more than is usually the case with errand boys. He had never forgotten the offer made by Mr. Lang, and one day, meeting that gentleman on the street, ventured to remind him that his present engagement was nearly out, adding, "You spoke to me about driving the wagon, sir." "Ah, so I did, but you are older now and worth more. Call around and see me." One evening, soon after, Jack lingered in Mr. Hill's office after the other errand boys had been paid and had gone away. "My 3 years are up tonight, sir," he said. "Yes, they are," said Mr. Hill, looking at him as if he had remembered it. "Will you give me a recommendation to someone else, sir?" "Well, I will, if you are sure that you want to leave me." "I did not know that you wanted me to stay, but—" He hesitated, and then went on, "My mother is a widow, and I feel as if I ought to do the best I can for her, and Mr. Lang told me to call on him." "Has Mr. Lang ever made you an offer?" Jack told him what Mr. Lang had said nearly 2 years before. "Why didn't you go then?" asked Mr. Hill. "Because I had promised to stay with you, but you wouldn't blame me for trying to better myself now." "Not a bit of it. Are you tired of running errands?" "I'd rather ride than walk," said Jack with a smile. "I think it is about time you were doing better than either. Perhaps you think that you have been doing this faithful work for me through these years for next to nothing, but if so, you are mistaken. You have been doing better work than merely running errands. You have been serving an apprenticeship to trust and honesty. I know you now to be a straightforward, reliable boy, and it takes time to learn that. It is your capital, and you ought to begin to realize it. You may talk to Mr. Lang if you wish, but I will give you a place in the office with a salary of $600 for the first year, with the prospect of a raise after that." Jack did not go to see Mr. Lang, but straight to his mother with a shout and a bound. You're right, mother," he cried. "No more hard work for you, mother. I'm wanted, you see, Wanted enough to get good pay. All the hardest part is over. Congregationalist. End of chapter 88. Recording by Christine Lehman, Reseda, California.
Chapter 89 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.K., Edison, New Jersey. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. Chapter 89. Wanted, an Employer. There was a northbound car temporarily disabled on Broadway near 4th Street, and, in consequence, as far as the eye could reach, stood a row of motionless cars. Also, in consequence, along the curb was ranged a fretting, impatient, helpless crowd, among whom the most anxious was probably Edward Billings Henry. In stature, Edward Billings Henry was briefer than his name would indicate, but to a certain two-room dwelling on Jackson Street he made up in importance what he lacked in height, and it was his overwhelming sense of this importance which made everything muscle taut and strained every nerve as he stood in the forefront of the crowd, his bare feet planted on the cold asphalt, one hand gripping his remaining stock of papers, the other clutching a nickel. "I never was in a tearing hurry in my life but that this thing happened," exploded a man just behind the boy. Edward Billings Henry turned and looked up. The man was jingling a lot of loose coins in his pocket. The boy looked at his one nickel and said, with conviction, "You can't need to have them go like I do." The big man stared down at the little man in surprise with a gruff, "Huh?" But Edward Billings Henry had no time to repeat. His hope had revived. The two men who lay on their backs under the injured car began to crawl out, and the boy rushed forward. "Will it go now?" he inquired of one of the numerous conductors clustered around. "Maybe so, in half an hour," replied the conductor carelessly. "Oh," cried the boy in dismay, "I just can't wait that long." "Walk, then," said the conductor crossly. "It's too far," replied the boy, "when you've got a stone toe." "A what?" ejaculated the conductor, but his voice was lost in the honk-honk of the big white touring car which pushed slowly through the crowd. In front of the car, Edward Billings Henry raced limpingly on his stone toe back to the curb and to the man jingling the coins in his pocket. "Just what time is it, please?" he asked. The man pulled out his watch and showed it to him. Edward Billings Henry heaved a great sigh. "10:30. It'll likely be filled up before I can get there." "What will be?" "The place I'm after." Skillfully he raised the limping foot, laid it across the other leg, and nursed the stone-bruised big toe, his eyes on the automobile which had halted almost in front of him. "Hello, Junius!" a voice in the crowd sang out. "Lucky man you, not to have to depend on street cars." The driver of the car was a young man. That is, Edward Billings Henry judged him to be young by the only feature visible, a flexible, wide mouth with clean-shaven lips. His eyes were behind goggles, and a cap covered his forehead and ears, meeting the tip of a high collar which effectually concealed his chin. But the mouth smiled as the goggles turned toward the pavement, the owner answering lightly, "Hello yourself, Dick. Jump in and try my luck." "Where are you going?" "Up to Congress Square." "Well, get along then," returned the other. "That's no good to me." Congress Square! What luck! Exactly where Edward Billings Henry wished to go. And here was a rapid transit vehicle with room enough for 10 such diminutive persons as he. Without loss of time, he limped up on his aching stone toe and jogged the arm of the driver. Junius looked down at the boy. Edward Billings Henry removed a man's derby from his head and looked out of eyes kindling with hope as he asked eagerly, "Do you suppose you could get me up there inside of 25 minutes, mister?" "What do you mean?" Junius stared hard through his goggles. "To Congress Square," said Edward Billings Henry impatiently. "It's business, and if I don't get there, I'm out of a job, that's all." The boy mounted the step and clung to the seat, proffering his nickel. "I'll pay just what I'd pay on the car," he argued, "so you'd be making some money as well as giving me a lift." The goggled eyes looked at the nickel in the dirty hand, and then traveled up and down the small figure back of the hand. The eyes noticed that while those parts of the boy's anatomy which had been exposed all the morning to the city dirt had collected grime, the rims, as it were, of the exposed parts revealed hidden cleanliness. "Congress Square is an awful way up," urged Edward Billings Henry, "and we mustn't waste much time, for I would like to get that job." The small hand extended the nickel enticingly toward the glove. "You'll be earning as much as a streetcar by giving a lift," the boy repeated. The driver's lips twisted a bit. "That's so," he said. "Ha ha!" he chuckled, and gracelessly extended his hand for the nickel. "Get in, my man, and I'll give you the lift." Edward Billings Henry drew a deep sigh of relief, dropped the coin into the other's palm, and engulfed himself in the soft front seat. "Whom have I the honor of giving a lift?" asked Junius formally, dropping the nickel into a pocket where it lay alone. After it he sent a curious, lingering smile. "Edward Billings Henry, Jr.," replied the boy. The lips beneath the goggles smiled. "And where am I lifting you to, may I also ask, Edward Billings?" "To Mr. Florence's office, where they're going to select an office boy this morning between 10 and 11. The driver busied himself a moment with the steering gear as the car passed the crowded mail wagons behind the post office building. Then he turned and shot a curious glance at his small companion, asking abruptly, "And you think you'll get the job, do you?" Edward Billings Henry leaned forward as if he could push the machine into a yet faster pace. "I can try for it," he replied. "Father says you never know what you can do unless you try. He's always wanting me to try." "Yes," muttered Junior, still more interested. "Fathers seem much alike, whether they live uptown or downtown." "Can't we go faster?" asked Edward Billings Henry, sitting on the edge of the seat. Junior shook his head. "Too many blue coats around. But about that job, now, you'll not be the only boy after it. There will probably be dozens older—" "I'm 11 if I'm small," interrupted the boy. "And stronger—" The boy stretched out a thin arm defiantly and closed his fist. "Just feel," he cried. "I've got a good muscle, and on my legs it's better yet. Just now I've got a stone bruise on my big toe, but I tell you, I can get round pretty fast just the same. I don't believe Mr. Florence would ever be sorry he took me." "Yes, I'm inclined to believe that myself," mused the man. "But how are you going to make him believe that in the beginning?" The boy raised his lame foot and gently rubbed the swollen big toe. "Well," he began, "I'm going to talk up big. Father says you have to, sometimes when nobody is around to do it for you. And he says it's all right if you do afterward just as big as you talk." The driver wagged his head wisely. "That's sound business sense," he agreed gravely. "You intend to deliver the same goods that you sell. Let's hear what you have to say." "Well, if you get me there in time to say anything, I'm going to tell Mr. Florence that Father went to school a lot when he was young. He went through high school and got all ready to go through college." Edward Billings emphasized his verbs as if going through was solely a physical exercise on the flying wedge order, and Junius chuckled. "Then I'll tell him that Father stood almost at the head of his class in high school, and he almost took a lot of honors." "Well," assented Junius, "that almost is a step farther than some of the rest of us got." "Yes," exulted the boy, "I guess Mr. Florence will say so too." "Then I'll tell him that Father taught a lot when he couldn't go through college." "What next?" inquired Junius. They were approaching 12th Street now, and the car was hardly moving in the press of vehicles. Edward Billings curled his bare toes under and unconsciously pushed forward with all his slender might. "Then I'll tell him that Father used to read a lot, law books and things, same as he does—" "But see here," interrupted Junius, "all this talk will be about your father. What are you going to say about yourself?" A cloud overspread Edward Billings' face. He raised a pair of troubled eyes to his questioner. "Why, I never stopped to think of that," he began, slowly, all the brightness fading out of his tone. "There's nothing much to say about me. I sell papers and help Father. "What does your father do?" asked Junius. The boy hesitated, his face flushed, and he looked up uncertainly at the goggles. "He used to teach, I told you," was the evasive answer, until his eyes gave out. "And now?" Edward Billings Henry wriggled about on the padded leather. "He's always had bad legs," the evasion continued, "but his arms and back are strong, and his legs all right to stand on." "Yes?" insisted Junius, and waited. "So he is doing something he ain't going to do if I can get this job. Then I could sell papers after and before office hours and earn a lot of money." Edward Billings Henry talked rapidly, but the young man beside him was not to be turned from his purpose. "Then what is it he is not going to do?" The boy hesitated again. "Father takes in washing," he finally burst out, proudly defiant, "and I help him, and we do it good, I tell you. No one ever complains. Father says if you can't do what you want to, you can try something else, and that was all he could do. So he tried and found out he could wash and iron good, and a lot of it." Junius considerately looked straight ahead of him, not wishing to add to the embarrassment of Edward Billings Henry, Jr., but he could not resist asking, "Are you going to tell this to Mr. Florence?" "No, sirree," reported the boy proudly. "Father ain't going to do washings any longer if I can get the job." The car entered Congress Square, drew up in front of an imposing stone building, and stopped. The driver removed his goggles and turned a pair of pleasant grey eyes on the boy. "Well, Edward Billings, here we are, and you've got the job all right. Can you come in the morning?" Edward Billings Henry nearly fell off the seat. "What?" he stammered. "The job is yours," smiled the young man. "I happen to be that same Mr. Florence who, you have assured me, will never regret employing you. My office is on the second floor here. I did advertise for a boy, but had totally forgotten it." He gave a short laugh. "Report in the morning, please, and we'll see about a suit and some shoes and that stone-bruised toe." Out of the automobile, Edward Billings Henry tumbled in a dazed condition, and stood beside his new employer looking up speechlessly. "I'll advance you a car fare on your salary," the young man continued. He carefully avoided the pocket where lay the nickel previously owned by his passenger, and produced the change. "And, Edward Billings, just tell your father from me that his maxims work out so well that I'm thinking of adopting them myself." Alice Lois Lee, in Youth's Companion, used by permission. End of chapter 89. Recording by S.K. Edison, New Jersey.
Chapter 90 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. Chapter 90. How to Stop Swearing. When I was out west 30 years ago, I was preaching one day in the open air when a man drove up in a fine turnout. After listening for a while, he put his whip to his fine-looking steed, and away he went. I did not expect to see him again, but the next night he came back, and he kept on coming regularly, night after night. I said to a gentleman, "Who is that man who drives up here every night? Is he interested?" "Interested? I should think not. You should have heard the way he talked about you today." "Well," I said, "that is a sign he is interested." I asked where he lived, but my friend told me not to go see him, for he would only curse me. I said, "It takes God to curse a man. Man can only bring curses on his own head." I found out where he lived and went to see him. He was the wealthiest man within 100 miles of that place, and had a wife and 7 beautiful children. Just as I reached his gate, I saw him coming out of the front door. I stepped up to him and said, "You are Mr. Davis, I believe?" He said, "Yes, sir, that is my name." Then he asked, "What do you want?" "Well," I said, "I should like to ask you a question if you won't be angry." "Well, what is it?" "I am told that God has blessed you above all men in this part of the country, that he has given you wealth, a beautiful Christian wife, and 7 lovely children. I do not know whether it is true, but I hear that all he gets in return is cursing and blasphemy." He said, "Come in, come in." I went in. "Now," he said, "what you said out there is true. If any man has a fine wife, I am the man, and I have a lovely family of children, and God has been good to me. But do you know, we had company here the other night, and I cursed my wife at the table, and did not know it till after the company was gone. I never felt so mean and contemptible in my life as when my wife told me of it. She said she wanted the floor to open and let her down out of her seat. If I have tried once, I have tried 100 times to stop swearing. You preachers don't know anything about it." "Yes," I said, "I know all about it. I have been a traveler." "But," he said, "you don't know anything about a business man's troubles. When he is harassed and tormented the whole time, he can't help swearing." "Oh, yes," I said, "he can. I know something about it. I myself used to swear." "What? You used to swear?" he asked. "How did you stop?" "I never stopped." "Why, you don't swear now, do you?" "No, I have not sworn for years." "How did you stop?" "I never stopped. It stopped itself." He said, "I don't understand this." "No," I said, "I know you don't. But I came to talk to you so that you will never want to swear again as long as you live." I began to tell him about Christ in the heart, how he would take the temptation to swear out of a man. "Well," he said, "how am I to get Christ?" "Get right down here and tell him what you want." But he said, "I was never on my knees in my life. I've been cursing all the day, and I don't know how to pray, or what to pray for." "Well," I said, "it is mortifying to call on God for mercy when you have never used his name except in oaths, but he will not turn you away. Ask God to forgive you if you want to be forgiven." He knelt down and prayed, only a few sentences. After he praised, he rose and said, "What shall I do now?" I said, "Go down to the church and tell the people there that you want to be an out-and-out Christian." "I cannot do that," he said. "I never go to church except to some funeral." "Then it is high time for you to go for something else," I said. At the next church meeting the man was there, and I sat right in front of him. He stood up and put his hands on the seat, and he trembled so much that I could feel the seat shake. He said, "My friends, you know all about me. If God can save a wretch like me, I want to have you pray for my salvation." That was 30 years ago. Some time since I was back in that town, but did not see him. But when I was in California, a man asked me to have dinner with him. I told him I could not do so. Then he asked me if I remembered him, and told me his name. "Oh," I exclaimed, "tell me, have you ever sworn since that night you knelt in the drawing-room and asked God to help you?" "No," he replied, "I have never had a desire to swear since then." D. L. Moody, in Weighed in the Balances, published by Morgan and Scott. End of chapter 90.
Chapter 91 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. The Carols of Bethlehem Center. There might have been no church had not the Reverend James Mackenzie come just when it seemed tottering to a fall. There might have been no Sunday school had not Harold Thornton tended it as carefully as he tended his own orchard. There might have been no class number 4 had it not been for Gertrude Windsor. But there would have been no glad tidings in one wintry heart, save for the voices with which Eddie and the 2 Willies and Charlie and little Phil sang the carols that morning in the snow. And they came straight from him who gave the angels the songs of On Earth Peace, Goodwill to Men. At the end of the winter term in Gertrude's junior year, the doctor had prescribed a year of rest for her, and she had come to find it with Aunt Mehitable in the quiet of Bethlehem Center. On her first Sunday, she attended the little Sunday school, and at the close of service there was an official conference. "She would be just the one if she would," said the pastor. "It can't go on as it is," answered the superintendent. "The deacon means well, but he doesn't know boys. There wasn't one here today, and only Eddie last Sunday. I wish she'd be chorister, too," he added. "Did you hear her sing?" I doubt if she would do that. I'm told she nearly broke down in college and is here to rest. Yes, so Mr. Thompson told me, but we do need her. Well, I will call on her and let you know what I learn. Gertrude hesitated. For had not the doctor said, "It is not so much college, Miss Windsor, it is church and Sunday school and Christian Endeavor and student volunteer and all the rest on top of college work that is breaking you down, and you must stop it." But the wistful face of Harry, who brought their milk, decided her, and the second Sunday saw her instructing Eddie and little Phil in the quarterly temperance lesson. It was not until school was over that she learned the reason of little Phil's conscious silence. And next day, when she met him with his father on the street, she tried to atone for her former ignorance. "Are you Phil's father?" she asked, stepping toward them. Tim Shartow, who was believed by some to regard neither God, man, nor the devil, grew strangely embarrassed as he took her hand, after a hurried inspection of his own. "Yes, he answered. "I am to be his Sunday school teacher," she went on. "And of course I want to know the fathers and mothers of my boys. I hope Phil can come regularly. We are going to have some very interesting lessons." "I guess he can come," answered his father. "It's a better place for him than on the street, anyway." This was faint praise, but well meant. Gertrude smiled her appreciation, and in that brief meeting won not only Phil's lifelong regard, but, had she known it, that of his father as well. For thenceforth Tim Shartow felt that he had two friends in Bethlehem Center of whom he need not be ashamed. His other friend was the Reverend James Mackenzie. The mutual though qualified respect which they felt for each other dated from their first meeting, when Mr. Mackenzie had walked into the saloon and asked permission to tack up some bills advertising his revival services. "I guess you can," the proprietor had answered, standing alertly on his guard. The bills had been posted, and the unwanted visitor turned to the man behind the bar. They were alone together. "We should be very glad, Mr. Shartow," he said, "if you would attend some of the meetings." "It'll be a cold day when I do," answered the saloon keeper. Mr. Mackenzie did not reply. "The worst enemies I've got are in that church," added Tim, by way of explanation. A smile lighted up the pastor's earnest face. "No, Mr. Shartow," he said. "You're wrong. They don't like your business. I don't like your business. But you haven't an enemy in our church. And I want to tell you now." His foot was upon the bar rail, and he was looking straight into the eyes of the man to whom he spoke, "that every night, as I pray that God will remove this saloon, I shall pray that he will bring you to know my Savior. And if ever you need help that I can give, I want you to feel free to come to me. We are traveling different roads, Mr. Shartow, but we are not enemies. We are friends." And the pastor departed, leaving Tim, the saloon keeper, that shook up, to use his own phrase, that it is doubtful whether he ever entirely regained his former attitude toward "them church folks." By Gertrude's second Sunday as teacher, the two Willies had come to test the truth of rumors that had reached them. Charlie and Harry came next, and, after Gertrude announced the midweek class meetings as a reward for full attendance, not one absence occurred for 13 weeks. To Harold Thornton, it had the look of a miracle that the class for whom no teacher could be found was as clay in the hands of the potter. There was nothing Gertrude could not do with them. They listened spellbound while she talked, took part in the responsive readings, answered questions, studied their lessons, sat wherever the superintendent wished. They even pocketed their papers without a glance at them until the session was over, and they sang with a wild abandon that was exhilarating to hear. Even Harry, who held throughout the note on which his voice first fastened, never failed to sing. And though it added little to the harmony, it spoke volumes for the spirit of the school and the devotion to the chorister. But if Gertrude was doing much for the boys, they were doing much for Gertrude. And in obeying her orders to rest, exercise, and grow strong, she could not have had better helpers. From the time when the first pale blossoms of the bloodroot showed beside the snow, through the seasons of violets and wild strawberries and goldenrod, to the time when the frost had spread the ground with the split shucks of the hickory nuts, the spoil of all the woodland was brought to her. Their class meetings became long tramps, during which Gertrude told them interesting things about insects, birds and flowers, and they told as much that was strange to her. Every one of them had become a conspirator in the plot to keep her out of doors, away from her books. Hardly a day passed that she did not go somewhere with one or more of them, and as the healthy color began to show beneath the tan, as strength came back, and every pulse beat brought the returning joy of life, she often felt that all her work for class number 4 had been repaid 100-fold. It was one mid-August afternoon, when the tasseled corn stood high, and the thistles had begun to take wing and fly away to join the dandelions, that there came the first thoughts of the carols. Harry had to drive cows that day, but the others were with her, and as they came out through Mr. Yert's woods, and looked down upon the pasture where the sheep were feeding, little Phil began the quaint old version of the shepherd psalm that she had taught them. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me down to lie." And the other boys joining, they sang through to the end. It was beautiful. She had never realized that they could sing so well, and suddenly, as she listened, the plan came full-grown into her mind, and she proposed it then and there. The boys were jubilant. For a half-hour they discussed details, and then, all seated on the ground, like those of whom they sang, she taught them the beginning of "While Shepherds Watched Their Flocks by Night." That was the first of many open-air rehearsals, transferred, when the weather grew colder, to Willie Yertz's, where there were no near neighbors to whom the portentous secret might leak out. There was not one defective voice in the class save Harry's, and he was at first a puzzle. But that difficulty vanished when it was learned that his fondest ambition was satisfied by striking the tuning fork. Thereafter all went smoothly, with much enthusiasm and a world of mystery. When the program was complete, they had by heart 6 songs. "While Shepherds Watched Their Flocks by Night," "Away in a Manger," "We Three Kings of Orient Are," "Hark the Herald Angels Sing," "There Came 3 Kings ere break of day," and last but best, because it seemed especially made for them, the song that began, "O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep the silent stars go by." And so at length came Christmas Eve. Little eyes were closing tight in determined efforts to force the sleep that would make the time till morning so much shorter. But in Bethlehem Center were 6 boys who, it is safe to say, were thinking less of the morrow's gifts than of the morning's plan, for preparations for early rising had been as elaborate as it were 4th of July, and there was a solemn agreement that not one present should be looked at until after their return. Gertrude had fallen asleep thinking of the letter beneath her pillow, promising her return to college at the beginning of next term. But at the first tinkle of her alarm clock, she was up, and, dressing by candlelight, went softly down the stairs and out into the keen air of the morning. The stars were still bright overhead, and there was no light in the east. But Gertrude Windsor was not the first abroad, for at the gate Eddie, the 2 Willies, and little Phil stood waiting, and already Harry and Charlie were seen coming at top speed. "Are we all here?" asked Eddie in a stage whisper, and the other boys huddled close together and wriggled with suppressed excitement. "Yes," answered Gertrude. "Which place is first?" "Mr. Mackenzie's," announced Charlie, whose part it was to lay out the route, and, crossing the road, they passed through the parsonage gate. Beneath the study windows, Harry, at a given signal, struck the tuning fork against his boot heel. Gertrude gave the key, and then, like one, there rose to greet the dawning of another Christmas day those clear young voices. "Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Peace on earth and mercy mild, God and sinners reconciled." There were sounds from within before they had finished the first stanza, but when, after the Amen, the pastor started to open a window, the boys were too quick for him. There was a volley of "Merry Christmas," and his answer reached only the rear guard tumbling over the picket fence. Beneath the bare apple-tree boughs in Harold Thornton's yard, Charlie, Eddie, and little Phil sang "We Three Kings of Orient Are," while the others joined in the chorus. At the song's close, the superintendent, swifter of foot than the pastor, overtook them with a great box of candy. Tears came into the eyes of Mrs. Martin as, watching beside her sick child, she heard again the story of the babe away in a manger, no crib for his bed. Old Uncle King forgot for a moment his vexing troubles as he listened to the admonition to rest beside the weary road and hear the angels sing. Mrs. Fenny cried, as sick people will, when she heard the boys reiterate the sweet triumphant notes. So from house to house the singers went, pausing at one because of sickness, at another because those within were lonely, at some for love, as they had serenaded the pastor and the superintendent, and bringing to each some new joy. The stars were fading out, and they had started to return. On their side of the street was the post office, and opposite them was the saloon, with its gaudy gilt sign, Tim's Place. Little Phil was behind Gertrude, and as they passed that building, it was home to him. His hand just touched her sleeve. "Do you think," he whispered, as she could see the pitiful quiver of his chin as he spoke, "do you suppose we could sing one for my father?" Tears filled Gertrude's eyes, and had she not known boys so well, she would have stooped and caught him in her arms. "Why, surely," she answered. "Which one do you think he would like best?" Phil had shrunk behind her, and beneath the gaze of the other boys his eyes were those of a little hunted animal at bay. "Bethlehem," he said huskily, and when Harry had struck the tuning fork, they began to sing together. "O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep the silent stars go by." The 24th had been a good day for business in Tim Shartow's place. He had had venison for free lunch. 2 mandolin and guitar players had been there all the evening, and there was more than $200 in the till. But now, in the quiet of the early morning, as he sat alone, the reaction had come. He remembered how Rob McFlynn had had too much, and gone home maudlin to the wife who had toiled all day at the washtub. He thought of the fight Joe Fryer and Tom Stacy had had, and he did not drink much himself. He despised a drunkard, and these things disgusted him. There was little Phil, too, quote, "the saloon keeper's boy," unquote, and that cut deep. Wouldn't it pay better in the long run? And then the music floated softly in. He did not hear the words at first, but he had a good ear. It was the singing that had brought him as a boy into the beer gardens, and, stepping to the window, he listened, all unseen by those without. There the words reached him. How silently the wondrous gift is given, so God imparts to human hearts the blessings of his heaven. No ear may hear his coming, but in this world of sin, where meek souls will receive him. And until they sang the Amen, Tim Shartow never stirred from the window. The storm that had been threatening all day had descended. Without, a blizzard was raging. But within, beside his study fire, the little ones tucked away in bed upstairs, and a book in his hand, the Reverend Mackenzie could laugh at weather. A knock at that hour surprised him, but when he saw who stood upon the threshold, he knew how the saloon-keeper felt when he posted his bills so many months before. "Good evening, Mr. Shartow," he said. "Won't you come in?" The face of his visitor was tense and haggard, for the struggle had lasted the day long. "I've come for help," he answered shortly. "I guess it's the kind you can give, all right." For a moment the pastor searched his face. "God bless you," he exclaimed. "Come in, come in." And so was wrought again, before the close of the day that had been ushered in by the singing of the carols, the ever-new miracle of Christmas, for God's gift to men had been again accepted, and into another heart made meek and ready to receive him the dear Christ had entered. Frederick Hall in Christian Endeavor World. End of the Carols of Bethlehem Center.
Chapter 92 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. Chapter 92. Standing Bear's Speech. The first time an Indian was permitted to appear in court in this country and have his rights tried was in the year 1897. Previous to this, every Indian in the United States was subject to the orders of the Secretary of the Interior. If he happened to be a man of tyrannical nature, the Indians fared hard. One Secretary of the Interior, at the point of the bayonet, had caused all the Poncas Indians to be driven from northern Nebraska down to Indian Territory, depriving them of lands to which they held government deeds. They were left in the new country for months without rations, and more than 1/3 of them died. Among these was the son of Standing Bear. The old chief refused to have the boy buried in the strange country, and gathering about 30 members of his tribe together, he started for their ancient hunting grounds, intending to bury his boy where generations of the Poncas chiefs lay. The Secretary of the Interior heard of the runaways, and through the War Department telegraphed to General Crook of Omaha to arrest the Indians and return them to Indian Territory. So General Crook arrested Standing Bear and his followers and took them all, with the old wagon that contained the body of the dead boy, down to Omaha. Standing Bear told his story to the general, who was already familiar with many wrongs that had been committed against the Indians, and who was indignant at their treatment. He detained the Indians at Omaha until he consulted with a Mr. Tibbles, an editor of a newspaper. They agreed to espouse the cause of the Indians, securing to Standing Bear a trial in the United States Court. It was the most notable trial ever brought in the West, and in fact the scope was as wide as any ever tried in this country, for upon its decision 100,000 persons were made citizens. Mr. Tibbles, who attended every session of the court, describes what took place in the following words. The courtroom was crowded with fashionably dressed women, and the clergy, which had been greatly stirred by the incident, were there in force. Lawyers, everyone in Nebraska, and many from the big eastern cities, businessmen, General Crook and his staff in their dress uniforms. This was one of those few times in his life that Crook wore full dress in public, and the Indians themselves in their gaudy colors. The courtroom was a galaxy of brilliancy. On one side stood the army officers, the brilliantly dressed women, and the white people. On the other side was Standing Bear in his official robes as chief of the Poncas, and with him were his leading men. Far back in the audience, shrinking from observation, was an Indian girl, who afterward became famous as a lecturer in England and America. She was later known on both continents by a translation of her Indian name, Instandiamba, Bright Eyes. Attorney Poppleton's argument was carefully prepared, and consumed 16 hours in the delivering, occupying the attention of the court for 2 days. On the third day Mr. Webster spoke for 6 hours, and during all the proceedings the courtroom was packed with the beauty and culture of the city. Toward the close of the trial the situation became tense, as the wrongs inflicted on the Indians were described by the attorneys. Indignation was often at white heat, and the judge made no attempt to suppress the applause which broke out from time to time. For the department, Mr. Lambertson made a short address, but was listened to in complete silence. It was late in the afternoon when the trial drew to a close. The excitement had been increasing, but it reached a height not before attained when Judge Dundee announced that Chief Standing Bear would be allowed to make a speech in his own behalf. Not one in the audience besides the army officers and Mr. Tibbles had ever heard an oration by an Indian. All of them had read of the eloquence of Red Jacket and Logan, and they sat there wondering if the mild-looking old man, with the lines of suffering and sorrow on his brow and cheek, dressed in the full robes of an Indian chief, could make a speech at all. It happened that there was a good interpreter present, one who was used to chief talk. Standing Bear arose, half facing the audience. He held out his right hand and stood motionless so long that the stillness of death which had settled down on the audience became almost unbearable. At last, looking up at the judge, he said, "That hand is not the color of yours, but if I prick it, the blood will flow, and I shall feel pain. The blood is of the same color as yours. God made me, and I am a man. I never committed any crime. If I had, I would not stand here to make a defense. I would suffer the punishment and make no complaints." Still standing, half facing the audience, he looked past the judge, out of the window, as if gazing upon something far in the distance, and continued, "I seem to be standing on a high bank of a great river, with my wife and little girl at my side. I cannot cross the river, and impassable cliffs arise behind me. I hear the noise of great waters. I look and see a flood coming. The waters rise to our feet, and then to our knees. My little girl stretches her hands toward me and says, 'Save me.' I stand where no member of my race ever stood before. There is no tradition to guide me. The chiefs who preceded me knew nothing of the circumstances that surround me. I hear only my little girl say, 'Save me.' In despair, I look toward the cliffs behind me, and I seem to see a dim trail that may lead to a way of life. But no Indian ever passed over that trail. It looks to be impassable. I make the attempt. I take my child by the hand, and my wife follows after me. Our hands and our feet are torn by the sharp rocks, and our trail is marked by our blood. At last I see a rift in the rocks. A little way beyond, there are green prairies. The swift running water, the Niobrara, pours down between the green hills. There are the graves of my fathers. There again we will pitch our teepee and build our fires. I see the light of the world and of liberty just ahead." The old chief became silent again, and after an appreciable pause, he turned toward the judge with such a look of pathos and suffering on his face that none who saw it will ever forget, and said, "But in the center of the path there stands a man. Behind him I see soldiers in numbers like the leaves of the trees. If that man gives me the permission, I may pass on to life and liberty. If he refuses, I must go back and sink beneath the flood." Then, in a lower tone, he said, "You are that man." There was silence in the court as the old chief sat down. Tears ran down over the judge's face. General Crook leaned forward and covered his face with his hands. Some of the ladies sobbed. All at once the audience, by one common impulse, rose to its feet, and such a shout went up as was never heard in a Nebraska courtroom. No one heard Judge Dundee say, "Court is dismissed." There was a rush for Standing Bear. The first to reach him was General Crook. I was second. The ladies flocked around him, and for an hour Standing Bear had a reception. A few days afterward, Judge Dundee handed down his famous decision in which he announced that an Indian was a person, and was entitled to the protection of the law. Standing Bear and his followers were set free, and with his old wagon and the body of the dead child, he went back to the hunting grounds of his fathers, and buried the body with tribal honors. From the Indian Journal. Some things we need. the courage born of God, not man, the truth to speak, cost what it may, the patience to endure the trials that form a part of every day, the purpose firm, the will to do, the right wherever we may be, the wisdom to reprove the faults that in our loved ones we may see, reprove in tone and spirit sweet, and never in temper's eloquence, the heart to love the ones in wrong, while wrong we hate in every sense, the strength to do our daily task as unto God, for we're his own, to seek his approbation sweet, and not men's praise, fame, or renown. To these and more are things we need, if Christ we'd represent indeed. C.C. Roberts. End of section 92.
Chapter 93 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. Some things we need. The courage born of God, not man. The trust to speak, cost what it may. The patience to endure the trials that form a part of every day. The purpose firm, the will to do the right wherever we may be. The wisdom to reprove the faults that in our loved ones we may see. Reprove in tone and spirit sweet, and never in temper's eloquence. The heart to love the ones in wrong, while wrong we hate in every sense. The strength to do our daily task as unto God, for we're his own. To seek his approbation sweet, and not men's praise, fame, or renown. These and more are things we need, if Christ we would represent indeed. C.C. Roberts. End of chapter 93. Recording by SaraHale.
Chapter 94 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. Chapter 94. Mabel Ashton's Dream. As the guests came together in the brilliantly lighted parlors at the home of Mabel Ashton that crisp winter evening, there was nothing unusual in the appearance of the rooms to indicate that the party to which they had been invited was to be in any respect different from the round of gaiety to which they had been devoting themselves for the greater part of the winter. Some of the guests, as they greeted their young hostess, noticed an unusual degree of nervousness in her manner, but, attributing it to the excitement of preparation and anticipation, thought no more of it, and all were soon engaged in conversation. The musicians were in their places, and the young people were beginning to wonder why the signal was not given for the orchestra to strike up, when Mabel Ashton, her sweet face flushed and pale by turns, took her stand near the musicians. After closing her eyes for a moment, during which the room became perfectly still, in a voice at first trembling, but clear and steady, she said, "Friends, I know you will think me very queer, but before we do anything else, I must tell you a little story. I had a dream last night which has made such an impression on my mind and heart that I must tell it to you. I dreamed that tonight had arrived, and you had all assembled in these rooms, when there came to the door, and was ushered in, a guest who seemed strangely familiar, and yet whom I could not recognize. He had a rare face, peaceful, yet a little sad in its expression, and his eyes were more penetrating than any that I had ever before seen. He was dressed in neat, yet very plain clothing, but there was something in his appearance which marked him as no ordinary man. While I was trying to think where I had seen him, he advanced to me, took my hand, and said gently, "You do not recognize me, Mabel?" Surprised at such a form of salutation from a stranger, I could only say, "Your face, sir, seems familiar, yet I cannot recall your name. Yet I am one whom you have invited here this evening, or I should rather say, one to whom both you and your parents have extended many invitations to be present here whenever I am able to come. You have even invited me to make my home here, and I have come tonight to join your little company. I beg 1,000 pardons, I replied, but you mystify me all the more, and I beg you will relieve me by telling me whom I have the pleasure of greeting. Then he offered to my view the palms of his hands, in which were scars as of nail wounds, and looked at me through and through with those piercing yet tender eyes, and I did not need that he should say to me, I am Jesus Christ your Lord. To say that I was startled would be to express only a very small part of my feelings. For a moment I stood still, not knowing what to do or say. Why could I not fall at his feet and say with all my heart, I am filled with joy at seeing you here, Lord Jesus? With those eyes looking into mine, I could not say it, for it was not true. For some reason, on the instant only half comprehended by myself, I was sorry he had come. It was an awful thought, to be glad to have all the rest of you here, yet sorry to see my Saviour. Could it be that I was ashamed of him, or was I ashamed of something in myself? At length I recovered myself in a degree and said, You wish to speak to my parents, I am sure. Yes, Mabel, as he accompanied me to where my mother and father sat gazing in surprise at my evident confusion in greeting an unexpected guest. But I came this evening chiefly to be with you and your young friends, for I've often heard you speak enthusiastically in your young people's meetings about how delightful it would be if you could have me visibly present with you. Again the blush came to my cheeks as the thought flashed through my mind, tomorrow night is prayer meeting night. I should have been delighted to see him then. But why not tonight on this pleasant occasion? I led him to my parents, and in a somewhat shamefaced fashion introduced him. They both gave a start of amazed surprise, but, convinced by his appearance that there was no mistake, my father recovered a degree of self-possession and bade him welcome, as he offered him a seat, remarking that this was an unexpected pleasure. After a somewhat lengthy pause, he explained to Jesus that his daughter Mabel, being very closely occupied with her studies and having little variety in life, had been allowed to invite a few friends in for a social evening, with a little quiet dancing by way of healthful exercise. Her friends were all of the very choicest, and he felt that this was a harmless amusement, which the church had come to look upon in a somewhat different light from that in which it was viewed 40 years ago. Removing the objectionable feature of bad company had made this pleasant pastime a safe indulgence. As my father stammered out in the presence of Jesus these words of apology which had fallen from my own lips, I felt myself flush crimson with shame both for my dear father and for myself. Why should he apologize at all for what he considered unquestionably right? How hollow it all sounded there in the presence of the Lord. Did not Jesus know that my studies were not so pressing, but that I could keep late hours, sometimes several nights in the week, at parties? Then father, anxious to relieve my evident embarrassment, said, I am sure we can leave these young people safely to themselves, and nothing would please me so well as to take you, my Lord Jesus, off into my study for a talk. No, said Jesus, Mabel has often invited me, and I came tonight especially to be with her. Will you introduce me to your friends, Mabel? Some of them I know, but some I do not know. Of course, all this time you, friends, were looking much in our direction, wondering at our embarrassment, and perhaps guessing that we had been made uncomfortable by the arrival of a not altogether welcome guest. I led him first to some of the church members among you, and there was not one of you who looked so comfortable after the introduction as before. As it became known who the guest was, faces changed color, and some of you looked very much as if you would like to leave the room. It really seemed as if the church members were quite as unwilling to meet Jesus as those who were not Christians. One of you came up quietly and whispered to me, Shall I tell the musicians not to play the dance music, but to look up some sacred pieces? Jesus caught the question, and looking us both squarely in the face, he simply asked, "Why should you?" And we could not answer. Someone else suggested that we could have a very pleasant and profitable evening if we should change our original plans and invite Jesus to talk to us. And he also was met with that searching question, "Why should my presence change your plans?" After I had introduced the Lord Jesus to you all, and no one knew what to do next, Jesus turned to me and said, "You were planning for dancing, were you not? It is high time you began, or you cannot complete your program before daylight. Will you not give the word to the musicians, Mabel?" I was much embarrassed. If my original plan was all right, his presence ought only to add joy to the occasion. Yet here were all my guests, as well as myself, made wretchedly uncomfortable by the presence of him whom most of us called our best friend. Determined to throw off this feeling and be myself, at his word I ordered the musicians to play for the first dance. The young man with whom I was engaged for that dance did not come to claim me, and no one went upon the floor. This was still worse embarrassment. The orchestra played once more, and 2 or 3 couples, more to relieve me than for any other reason, began to dance in a rather formal fashion. I was almost beside myself with shame and confusion, when the Lord Jesus turned to me and said, "Mabel, your guests do not seem at ease. Why do you not, as their hostess, relieve their embarrassment by dancing yourself? Would it help you any if I should offer to dance with you?" My confusion gave way to an expression almost of horror, as I looked into those tenderly sad eyes and cried, "You dance? You cannot mean it." "Why not, Mabel? If my disciples may dance, may not I? Did you think all this winter, when you and others of my disciples have gathered for the dance, or the card party, or at the theater, that you left me at home or in the church? You prayed for my presence in the prayer meeting. You did not quite want it here, but why not, my dear child? Why have you not welcomed me tonight, Mabel? Why has my presence spoiled your pleasure? Though I am a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, yet I delight to share and increase all the pure joys of my disciples. Is it possible that you leave me out of any of your pleasures, Mabel? If so, is it not because you feel that they do not help you to become like me and to glorify me, that they take your time and strength and thought to such an extent that you have less delight in my word and in communion with me? You have been asking, "What's the harm?" Have you asked, "What is the gain?" Have you done these things for the glory of God? It was plain to me now. Overcome with self-reproach and profound sorrow, I threw myself on the floor at his feet and sobbed out my repentance. With a "Daughter, go in peace, thy sins be forgiven thee," he was gone. I awoke and found that it was all a dream. And now I want to ask you, my friends, shall we go on with the program tonight, or shall we take these lists which we have prepared and discuss for a time with our partners the question, what can young people do to make the world better for their having lived in it? As the vote was unanimous in favor of the latter plan, which was followed by other wholesome recreations, and as the social evening was declared the most delightful of the winter, it is safe to say that the Lord Jesus had sent that dream for others besides Mabel Ashton. Presbyterian Journal. End of chapter 94.
Chapter 95 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories Worth Rereading by Various, a sad but true story. It was in the large parlors of a mansion in Missouri, where on a pleasant October evening 10 or 12 young people were gathered from the wealthiest homes of the elite of the city. Among them was a young woman who, though always genial and social with the young, was ever clad in mourning garb, and bore the name of Mara, chosen by herself to express the grief and bitterness of her life since the time when she, 7 or 8 years before, had been bereft of all her family. The pleasant hours flew fast till about 10:30 in the evening, when one of the company pulled out a pack of cards and flung it on the table where Mara Moore was sitting. The effect was startling. Her face took on a deathly pallor. She trembled, arose from her seat, staggered across the room, and took a chair in the remotest corner. So great was her agitation that every one saw it, but none was aware of the cause. One of the party, who had been reading low for some time, not imagining the seriousness of her anguish, went to her, and in a bantering way threatened her with a legal prosecution before an impaled jury in case she refused to return to her place at the table and submit to the regulations of the evening. While the lawyer was urging her to this, a thoughtless young man of the company stepped up to them and placed a few cards in her hand. She jerked her hand away and gave it a sling, as if to rid it of the contaminating filth of the cards, and with an agonizing scream she began weeping and sobbing as if her heart would break. Surprised at this new outburst, the lawyer sought to soothe the wounded spirit, and when she had become somewhat quiet, he, with the rest, entreated her to give them the reason for her terrible agitation. This she at first refused to do, but being urged very strongly by all the company, she at length consented. At the first word a shudder passed over her whole frame, but pausing to regain her self-control, she began. When I was 19 years old, I was living in an eastern city in one of the happiest homes within its limits. A rich and tender father, with a loving and gentle mother, and as bright and true a brother as ever a sister could want, were my companions in the delightful home of my childhood. Wealth and comfort smiled upon us, and prophesied of future happiness, until, with my own hand, I plucked down upon us all the greatest curse imaginable. Two of our cousins, a brother and sister, came to visit us, and we spent the evening in pleasant conversation, as we did this evening. And just as those cards were thrown upon the table, and at about the same hour, my parents having retired, our cousin threw a deck upon our table. They too and I sat down to play, while my dear and tenderly loved brother, not liking the idea of playing cards, turned to his music, which he was composing as a graduating exercise for examination day, and went to work at that. We three needed a fourth one to make the game go properly, and we began trying to persuade my brother to come and take part with us. But he declared he thought it was not right to spend time in card playing, that it was an amusement of the lowest character, and he did not want to get into it. After using all our arguments to induce him to assist us, but to no purpose, I went to him, put my arm around his neck, and told him that I was a Christian, and was trying to get to heaven, and thought it no harm to play cards just for amusement; that I thought he ought to lay aside his scruples and come and help us, as we could have no fun without his help; that he was too fastidious anyway. With this he arose from his seat very reluctantly, and came protesting that he knew nothing about it. We told him he could soon learn, and he did, only too quickly, for in a little time he was enough for any of us, and when we three had become tired of the sport, he was so delighted with it that he sat for an hour studying the cards and shuffling them. We laughed heartily at him for his interest in the matter, and finally retired for the night, leaving him with the cards. Next morning he took them up again, and tried to induce us to play with him, but our cousins had to go home, and soon left us, taking the deck with them. But the fatal act had been done. That night my brother was in the city until a late hour, which was a thing that had never occurred before. When he came home he seemed morose, and to our inquiries for the cause his replies were evasive. The next night he was out again, and this continued for some nights, until his money, $200, was all gone. He then went to father for more, and as he had unbounded confidence in my brother, father very readily gave him quite a little sum, without asking what he was going to do with it. This was soon gone. When he asked for more, father desired him to tell what he was doing with so much money. Not receiving a direct answer, father gave him a small sum and told him he could get no more unless he would give a clear report of the use he made of his money. This money was soon spent, and when he went for more, but was unwilling to account for what he had received, father refused to give him more. With this refusal he became angry, and told father he would make him willing to let him have the money. My brother then went into the city again, and as usual into a gambling den, where he managed to get money for gaming, or sat and looked on. He was absent for nearly a week. During this time my mother neither ate nor slept, as I might say, and when my brother was brought home drunk, she took her bed and never got up again, but died of a broken heart within a few days. We hoped this would stop my brother's course, but it did so only for a short time. He soon began gambling and drinking again, and, being young and rather delicate, it was not long until he was brought home in delirium tremens. Upon this father took his bed, languished, sank, and died, leaving myself and my brother alone in the world. Oh, how I wished I could die too! But it seemed that God determined that I should see the end of my work in wrecking our family, and I was compelled to still remain, and reap the harvest of my own doings. Every influence that could be brought to bear on my poor brother I made use of, but to no avail, and oh how I prayed for him! But it was of no use. He went even more rapidly down the way of ruin, now that father was dead and out of his way. Only a few weeks after I had followed my father to his resting place in the silent grave, my brother was brought home with delirium tremens again, and after suffering for a short time the most terrible agony, the poor boy died and was laid in a drunkard's grave. Oh my God, why was I ever born? Why cannot I die too? But what will my eternity be for having just ruined my own brother, the bright and beautiful boy? This is why I spell my name Mara. Soon after the lady commenced her sad story, the ladies in the company began weeping, and when it was finished, they were all sobbing as if their hearts would break, and the eyes of the men were also moist. The cards had disappeared, and vows were solemnly expressed by the entire company that never again would one of them be guilty of engaging in that sport, but that they would ever do their best to endeavor to put the practice out of society. Selected. End of chapter 95. Recording by SaraHale.
Chapter 96 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by andrewjasper, Sutton. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. Chapter 96. Are you sowing to the flesh? Are you sowing to the flesh, O youth? Have you turned your back upon the truth? Are you scattering seeds of evil from the garner of the devil? Are you thinking of the harvest by and by? Soon will spring and summer pass, brown and sere will grow the grass. No time then for good seed sowing. You and I must gather what we've sown, forsooth. Are you sowing to the flesh, O youth? Are you sowing to the flesh, O maid? Can you think of the harvest unafraid? Is this world your only treasure? This life all your joy and pleasure? Are you laying up no portion in the sky? He that soweth to the wind shall a whirlwind's harvest find, and he'll see himself a pauper by and by. We must reap of what we sow. It is said, Are you sowing to the flesh, O maid? End of chapter 96. Recording by Andrew Jasper, Sutton.
Chapter 97 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christi Lufer. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. Chapter 97. The Man That Died for Me. For many years I wanted to go as a foreign missionary, but my way seemed hedged about. At last I went to live in California. Life was rough in the mining country where I lived with my husband and little boys. While there, I heard of a man who lived over the hills and was dying of consumption. The men said, "He's so vile that no one can stay with him. So we place some food near him and leave him for 24 hours. We'll find him dead sometime, and the sooner the better. Never had a relative, I guess." This pitiful story haunted me as I went about my work. For 3 days I tried to get someone to go to see him and find out if he was in need of better care. As I turned from the last man, vexed with his indifference, the thought came to me, why not go yourself? Here is missionary work, if you want it. I will not tell how I weighed the probable uselessness of my going, nor how I shrank from one so vile as he. It was not the kind of work I wanted. But, at last, one day, I went over the hills to the little abode. It was a mud cabin containing but one room. The door stood open. In one corner, on some straw and colored blankets, I found the dying man. Sin had left awful marks on his face, and if I had not heard that he could not move, I should have retreated. As my shadow fell over the floor, he looked up and greeted me with an oath. I stepped forward a little, and again he swore. "Don't speak so, my friend," I said. "I ain't your friend. I ain't got any friends," he said. "Well, I am your friend, and—" But the oaths came quickly, and he said, "You ain't my friend. I never had any friends, and I don't want any now." I reached out at arm's length the fruit I had brought for him, and, stepping back to the doorway, asked if he remembered his mother, hoping to find a tender place in his heart. But he cursed her. I spoke of God, and he cursed him. I tried to speak of Jesus and his death for us, but he stopped me with his oaths, and said, "That's a lie. Nobody ever died for others." I went away discouraged, saying to myself that I knew it was of no use. But the next day I went again, and every day for 2 weeks. He did not show the gratitude of a dog, and at the end of that time I said that I was not going any more. That night, as I was putting my little boy to bed, I did not pray for the miner. My little boy noticed it and said, "Mama, you did not pray for the bad man." "No," I answered with a sigh. "Have you given him up, Mama?" "Yes, I guess so." "Has God given him up, Mama? Ought you to give him up till God does?" I could not sleep that night. I thought of the dying man, so vile, and with no one to care. I rose and went away by myself to pray, but the moment that I knelt, I was overpowered by the sense of how little meaning there had been to my prayers. I had had no faith. I had not really cared, beyond a kind of half-hearted sentiment. I had not claimed his soul for God. Oh, the shame of such a missionary zeal! I fell on my face, literally, as I cried, "O Christ, give me a little glimpse of the worth of a human soul." Did you, Christian, ever ask that and mean it? Do not do it unless you're willing to give up ease and selfish pleasure, for life will be a different thing to you after this revelation. I remained on my knees until Calvary became a reality to me. I cannot describe those hours. They came and went unheeded, but I learned that night what I had never known before, what it was to travail for a human soul. I saw my Lord as I had never seen him before. I knelt there till the answer came. As I went back to my room, my husband said, "How about your miner?" "He is going to be saved." "How are you going to do it?" he asked. "The Lord is going to save him, and I do not know that I shall do anything about it," I replied. The next morning brought a lesson in Christian work which I had never learned before. I had waited on other days until afternoon, when, my work being over, I could change my dress, put on my gloves, and take a walk while the shadows were on the hillsides. That day, the moment my little boys went to school, I left my work, and without waiting for gloves or shadows, hurried over the hills, not to see that vile wretch, but to win a soul. I thought the man might die. As I passed on, a neighbor came out of her cabin and said, "I'll go over the hills with you." I did not want her to go, but it was another lesson for me. God could plan better than I could. She had her little girl with her, and as we reached the cabin, she said, "I'll wait out here." I do not know what I expected, but the man greeted me with an awful oath. Still, it did not hurt, for I was behind Christ, and I stayed there, and I could bear what struck him first. While I was changing the basin of water and towel for him, things which I had done every day, but which he had never thanked me for, the clear laugh of the little girl rang out upon the air. "What's that?" the man said eagerly. "It's a little girl outside waiting for me." "Would you mind letting her come in?" said he, in a different tone from any I had heard before. Stepping to the door, I beckoned to her, then, taking her hand, said, "Come in and see the sick man, Mamie." She shrank back as she saw his face, but I assured her with, "Poor sick man, he can't get up. He wants to see you." She looked like an angel, her bright face framed in golden curls, and her eyes tender and pitiful. In her hands she held the flowers she had picked from the purple sage, and, bending toward him, she said, "I'm sorry for you, sick man. Will you have a posy?" He laid his great bony hand beyond the flowers on the plump hand of the child, and tears came to his eyes as he said, "I had a little girl once. Her name was Mamie. She cared for me. Nobody else did. Guess I'd been different if she'd lived. I've hated everybody since she died." I knew at once that I had the key to the man's heart. The thought came quickly, born of that midnight prayer service, and I said, "When I spoke of your mother and your wife, you cursed them. I know now that they were not good women, or you could not have done it." "Good women? Oh, you don't know nothing about that kind of woman. You can't think what they was." "Well, if your little girl had lived and grown up with them, wouldn't she have been like them? Would you have liked to have her live for that?" He evidently had never thought of that, and his great eyes looked off for a full minute. As they came back to mine, he cried, "Oh, God, no! I'd killed her first. I'm glad she died." Reaching out and taking the poor hand, I said, "The dear Lord didn't want her to be like them. He loved her even better than you did, so he took her away. He's keeping her for you. Don't you want to see her again?" "Oh, I'd be willing to be burned alive 1,000 times over if I could just see my little girl once more, my little Mamie." Oh, friends, you know what a blessed story I had to tell that hour. And I had been so close to Calvary that night that I could tell it in earnest. The poor face grew ashy pale as I talked, and the man threw up his arms as if his agony was mastering him. 2 or 3 times he gasped as if losing his breath. Then, clutching me, he said, What's that you said t'other day about talking to someone out of sight?" "It is praying. I tell him what I want." "Pray now, quick. Tell him I want my little girl again. Tell him anything you want to." I took the hands of the child and placed them on the trembling hands of the man. Then, dropping on my knees with the child in front of me, I bade her pray for the man who had lost his little Mamie and wanted to see her again. As nearly as I remember, this was Mamie's prayer. "Dear Jesus, this man is sick. He's lost his little girl and he feels bad about it. I'm so sorry for him, and he's sorry too. Won't you help him and show him how to find his little girl? Do, please. Amen." Heaven seemed to open before us, and there stood one with the prints of the nails in his hands and the wound in his side. Mamie slipped away soon, and the man kept saying, "Tell him more about it. Tell him everything. But oh, you don't know." Then he poured out such a torrent of confession that I could not have borne it but for the one who was close to us at that hour. By and by the poor man grasped the strong hand. It was the third day when the poor, tired soul turned from everything to him, the mighty to save, the man that died for me. He lived on for weeks, as if God would show how real was the change. I had been telling him one day about a meeting, when he said, "I'd like to go to a meeting once." So we planned a meeting, and the men from the mills and the mines came and filled the room. "Now, boys," he said, "get down on your knees while she tells about that man that died for me." I had been brought up to believe that a woman should not speak in meeting, but I found myself talking, and I tried to tell the simple story of the cross. After a while he said, "Boys, you don't half believe it or you'd cry. You couldn't help it. Raise me up. I'd like to tell it once." So they raised him up, and between his short breathing and coughing, he told the story. He had to use the language he knew. "Boys," he said, "you know how the water runs down the sluice boxes and carries off the dirt and leaves the gold behind. Well, the blood of that man she tells about went right over me just like that. It carried off about everything, but it left enough for me to see Mamie and to see the man that died for me. Oh, boys, can't you love him?" Some days after, there came a look into his face which told that the end had come. I had to leave him, and I said, "What shall I say tonight, Jack?" "Just good night," he said. "And what will you say to me when we meet again?" "I'll say good morning, over there." The next morning the door was closed, and I found two men sitting silently by a board stretched across two stools. They turned back the sheet from the dead, and I looked on the face, which seemed to have come back a little nearer to the image of God. "I wish you could have seen him when he went," they said. "Tell me about it." "Well, all at once he brightened up, about midnight, and smiling said, 'I'm going, boys. Tell her I'm going to see the man that died for me.' And he was gone. Kneeling there with my hands over those poor cold ones, which had been stained with human blood, I asked that I might understand more and more the worth of a human soul, and be drawn into a deeper sympathy with Christ's yearning compassion, not willing that any should perish. Mrs. J.K. Barney. A poem. How wonderful! He answered all my prayer abundantly, and crowned the work that to his feet I brought, with blessing more than I had asked or thought, a blessing undisguised and fair and free. I stood amazed and whispered, Can it be that he hath granted all the boon I sought? How wonderful that he for me hath wrought! How wonderful that he hath answered me! O faithless heart, he said that he would hear and answer thy poor prayer, and he hath heard and proved his promise. Wherefore didst thou fear? Why marvel that thy Lord has kept his word? More wonderful if he should fail to bless expectant faith and prayer with good success. F. R. Havergal. End of chapter.
Chapter 98 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. How wonderful! He answered all my prayers abundantly, and crowned the work that to his feet I brought, with blessing more than I had asked or thought, a blessing undisguised and fair and free. I stood amazed and whispered, Can it be that he hath granted all the boon I sought? How wonderful that he for me hath wrought! How wonderful that he hath answered me! O faithless heart! He said, and he would hear and answer thy poor prayer, and he hath heard and proved his promise. Wherefore didst thou fear? Why marvel that thy Lord hath kept his word? More wonderful if he should fail to bless expectant faith and prayer with good success. F. R. Havergal. End of chapter 98.
Chapter 99 of Stories Worth Rereading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine Lehman, Reseda, California. Stories Worth Rereading by Various. Chapter 99. Our Grass Rug and Other Things. Our house isn't so very nice. We own it, of course, and that is a great deal, as Mother has often reminded us when we grumbled. But we girls always thought there were some drawbacks even to that, because we couldn't ask a landlord for new paper or fresh paint, and as for us, we never had money to spare for such superfluities. There are only 4 of us, Mother and Jack, Rose and me. We children have been busy all our lives trying to get educated, so we could keep Mother in luxury after a while. In the meantime, she had done with bare necessities, for the life insurance Father left wasn't large enough to take any liberty with. Mother has things spick and span. No palace could be more beautifully kept than our home, but the furnishing is nothing whatever to boast of. Our room was almost the worst of all, with its odds and ends of things. Other girls have silver-backed hairbrushes, wailed Rose one night, regarding her old one with a scornful glance. Yes, and chairs that don't tip one over, I added, as I managed to save myself from a fall. Isn't it horrid to be poor, Meta? Said Rose. It's no joke. I was very grim, because I had bruised my hand on the rickety chair, and tomorrow was music lesson day, as I remembered. It was then and there we rebelled. Not so Mother could hear us. We weren't mean enough for that. She'd have been only too glad to help matters if she could. So we had our indignation meeting by our 2 selves. We said we'd had enough of old furniture and cheap sash curtains, and we decided it was time to act. Having reached this decision, we proceeded to carry it out, and we surprised ourselves with the speed of our achievements. My hope lay in music, Rose's in arithmetic. I trailed around the neighborhood next day looking for scholars, and Rose betook herself straight down to the Cowans, who had been hunting for a coach for their twins. We had discussed the Cowan possibility some time before, but Rose declared then that she couldn't spare a minute from the demands of her studies, while I knew it would keep me busy to be graduated on schedule time without doing anything outside. It makes a difference when you get interested in something for yourself. As soon as ever we girls viewed these occupations in the light of furnishings for our room, we felt sure we could squeeze them in, and we did. I got 6 beginners, and Rose captured the Cowans root and branch, 4 instead of 2, for it seemed they were not proficient in mathematical pursuits, and their mother was delighted to get them off her distracted hands. All our friends know that Rose adores sums and problems, and she didn't need any other recommendations. Well, we did it. It wasn't easy, either. If my half-dozen aspirants for fame escaped shaking till their teeth chattered, it wasn't because I didn't ache to administer it. And Rose feared her hair would be white before the end of the term. You see, when there's a certain amount of housework you feel obliged to do, and when your studies fairly clamor for attention the rest of the time, it sets your nerves all awry to keep the tempo for clumsy fingers that go just half as fast as they should, or to teach over and over again that 4 times 5 are always 20. But I suppose all these trials helped us to appreciate our possessions when we did get them. They were just as sweet and dainty as we had hoped. We got 2 single beds, white enamel with brass trimmings, and a pretty mirror in a neat frame. Our old dressing table looked like new, with fresh drapery, and there were full-length curtains to match. 2 cunning white rockers, 2 other chairs, and a little round stand made us feel simply blissful. We painted our bookshelves with white enamel paint, and did our woodwork ourselves. Jack painted the floor a soft gray that would blend with anything, and after it was dry we laid on it one of our chief treasures. It was a grass rug in 2 shades of green, with a stenciled border and a general air of elegance that almost overpowered us. It was large enough almost to cover the floor, and we stenciled green borders on our curtains and drapery in the same Grecian pattern. It seemed too good to be true as we stood in the door and viewed the landscape o'er after we had it done. "It isn't often that our dreams come true," sighed Rose. "But this one has," I assured her. She nodded happily. "Yes, and it's just as nice as we thought it would be. Won't it do our hearts good to 'give notice,' as the cooks say? I can hardly wait to tell those awful Cowans that they may get along as best they can. I'm so tired of them, Meta." "I know you are. I wouldn't mind the music so much if I had time, but it's dreadful when your own studies drag like millstones about your neck. I'm not clever at learning as you are, Rose. I have to work for what I get. So I shall tell them next Tuesday that I've decided not to teach any more till school's out." Jack stopped on his way down the hall to look over our shoulders. "Huh," he said, "if you know what that means." "Doesn't it look lovely?" asked Rose, her face all full of dimples. Rose is as pretty as a picture anyway, and when she smiles, you can't help smiling back. Jack patted her cheek and said, "It certainly does," and then he passed on abruptly. "Something doesn't suit him," I declared as he shut his room door behind him. "I can't imagine what it is, and it's of no earthly use to ask him." "It wouldn't have been. You can't worm a thing out of that boy till he gets ready to tell." Mother came up the stairs just then, waving a note in her hand. "It's from Helen Hunt," she announced joyfully. "She is going to spend a day and a night with us next week on her way to Grovesport. I shall be so glad to see her. Mrs. Hunt and Mother have been friends more years than Rose and I have lived, and they very seldom meet any more. So we girls were almost as glad as Mother was, because that dear woman doesn't have as many pleasures as she deserves." After we went to bed that night, we planned the surprise. The visitors should have our lovely new nest, and we'd go and camp in the shabby old guest room. We knew it would please Mother, for she hadn't had so pretty a place to entertain Mrs. Hunt in for many years. It did please her, too, so much that she almost cried, and she hugged us and thanked us till we felt very happy and self-satisfied. Jack was standing by, and he said, "Huh," again, in that same queer tone. Then Mother turned and hugged him, and Rose and I said to each other how strange it was that Jack should be jealous of his own sisters. It shone the day she came, the room I mean, though the sun was on duty too. Mother went to the station to meet her, and, as she started out, she called back, "Children, if any of you have occasion to go into my room while I'm gone, be sure to shut the door when you come out." We answered, "All right," all three at once, and then Rose said, "How funny! What do you suppose made her tell us to do that?" "I can't imagine," I replied, and then Jack smiled. If it had been anybody but our jolly old Jack, I'd have said his smile was sarcastic, but no one ever accused that boy of anything so ill-natured. Then he said in a quiet, even voice, "It doesn't take a Solon to see through that. She wants to make sure that Mrs. Hunt doesn't see the contrast between her room and the one across the hall. She might not understand or approve." And with that he took his cap and went out. Stunned? I guess we were. Rose and I stared at each other as if we'd seen a ghost. Then we put our arms around each other and went upstairs without a word. It was Mother's door we opened, and we stood there and gazed as if we'd never seen that room before. She had been darning her carpet again. We could see the careful stitches and the frayed edges her art couldn't quite conceal. "She has polished her furniture, too. See how it shines, Meta. She tried to make it look its best." Rose's voice was mournful, so I tried to speak up cheerfully. "To be sure she did, and succeeded." Then we turned, and both of us choked back a sob at what we saw. She had taken our discarded dressing-table drapery, cut out the best portions, ruffled it daintily, pressed it neatly, and put it on her own bureau. Our worn-out sash curtains, nicely laundered, veiled her book-rack. "Meta, our mother, our precious jewel of a mother, we've taken everything for ourselves and left her the rags." Rose had her head on my shoulder, and by that time I was crying as hard as she was. "No wonder Jack was dissatisfied," I sobbed. "Rose, why didn't he tell us?" "Oh, Meta, why did we need telling? That's what breaks my heart. Even our rickety chair fixed up and set back in the shadow. Oh, I can't stand it." "We've got to." I stiffened up grimly. "We've got to stand it, and it serves us right. But we'll make it up to her as soon as Mrs. Hunt is gone." "Yes, if we can live till then." "I think we'll manage to. Mortification won't kill us in 24 hours. We'll make her sleep in there tonight, and they can have one cozy visit in suitable quarters. Monsters!" Rose didn't resent the epithet. She knew it was appropriate. We did some thinking that night. I never felt so utterly insignificant in my life. We realized at last that there are other ways to show love than letting its object do all the sacrificing, all the giving and enduring, while the one who bestows it revels in selfishness. We didn't say anything then, but Mother wasn't allowed to touch that supper, only the portion of it that filled her own plate, and she didn't wash a dish after it either. If Rose and I sat over our books an hour after our usual bedtime, in consequence, it hurt no one but ourselves, and we deserved it. They had a lovely time together. We could hear their soft voices rise and fall, with, once in a while, a ripple of laughter, till we dropped off to sleep. The next night, Mother went back to her own room. We didn't say a word to prevent it, though it hurt us to think of our old duds in there for Mother to use. Next day the early morning post brought a note from Mrs. Hall, an old neighbor, urging Mother to meet her downtown at 10 o'clock. There was some important shopping on hand, and Mother's advice was indispensable. The dear thing didn't suspect that her daughters had frantically besought Mrs. Hall the day before to concoct some scheme that would clear the coast at home. "All day, Mrs. Hall," we pleaded. "We've planned a surprise for her, and it will take a good while to arrange it." Mother didn't see how she could be spared to go, but we assured her that since we'd be at home, she wasn't needed at all. If this struck her as a most unusual state of affairs, she was too polite to say so, and, true to her habit of helpfulness, she dressed and went to Mrs. Hall's rescue. We didn't waste any time, I assure you. We couldn't paint her floor then, but Jack stained it around the edges where it wouldn't have to be walked on, and the grass rug covered the rest. We burned the made-over rags. It did our hearts good to see them crisp and turn to ashes. Into the attic went the ugly old things, and across the hall came the pretty new ones. Curtains, dressing-table, chairs, every single dainty belonging, even the drapery from our bookshelves. Teddy Ward came in and helped carry things, and Jack worked like a beaver. He didn't need any urging either. If ever a boy's face shone like a full moon, Jack's did that happy day, though he stopped at least a dozen times to hug his sisters. "What a beast I was to think you could be as selfish as all that!" he exclaimed once. "I ought to have known better." "But we were just that selfish, Jackie," we told him. "We didn't mean to sail under false colors. We'd never have thought if it hadn't been for you." "Yes, you would. The first jolt would have waked you up. Lend a hand here, Meta." It was done at last, all cozy and fresh. Rose stopped in the door. "It looks like Mother," she said, and her voice was husky. "It's pure and sweet, like her." "The other one looks pretty forlorn, girls. What are you going to do about it?" Jack had a hand on our shoulders as he spoke, and we felt his sympathy. "Do?" we chirped up, as brisk as millionaires. "Why, furnish it, of course." "We have one bed to start on," Rose reminded him. "That's a big help, and the floor and woodwork are still painted. How are we to do it? Lessons, to be sure, cowens and scales." "Thought you wanted to quit." Our brother looked troubled for all his satisfaction. "My son, we have changed our minds. Our most ardent desire now is to keep on," I told him. Rose smiled drolly. "I am seriously considering refurnishing the entire domicile," she remarked. "The Cowens are good for the next 20 years, judging from their present attainments, and it's fine practice for me." We didn't give Mother a hint till after supper. It was hard to wait, but we made ourselves do it so everything would come about quite naturally. She took her bonnet and wrap up to put them away, and we three tagged as softly as if we had pads on our feet, like cats. She opened her door and gave one bewildered glance. Then she turned and saw us. "It's yours, lovey, every bit," we told her. "Darlings, I couldn't," she said. "Your hard work, your dear new treasures. I couldn't permit such a sacrifice, my darlings." We just would not cry, though the lumps in our throats made our voices sound as if they belonged to some other family. "They aren't our new treasures, they're yours. Who has been making sacrifices all our lives? We love you so, you couldn't hurt us by refusing, lovey." "There is no question of refusing." Rose spoke with great emphasis. "This room is hers, once for all, and there is no more to be said about it." We tucked her into her pretty white bed that night, and we kissed the dear face on the ruffled pillow. Jack came in for his good night, too, and we all stood looking down at her, so happy we couldn't talk. She lifted her arms, those arms that had worked so hard for us, and gathered the three of us to her at once. "My darlings," was all she said, and we crept out softly, knowing we had received her benediction. Yes, we are getting our second collection of furniture into shape, slowly but surely. But we have learned that there are more precious things to be had in homes than beds and chairs, or even green grass rugs. We have them, the precious things. So, now that Mother's room is accomplished, we can wait very happily for the beds and chairs, Rose and Jack and I. Elizabeth Price, in St. Nicholas, copyrighted by the Century Company, 1913. The tender words unspoken, the letters never sent, the long forgotten messages, the wealth of love unspent. For these some hearts are breaking, for these some loved ones wait. Show them that you care for them before it is too late. End of chapter 99. Recording by Christine Lehman, Reseda, California. End of Stories Worth Rereading by Various.